In the wreckage of post-World War I Germany, while crowds shouted in the streets and savings evaporated overnight, a thin, soft-spoken young man was quietly hunting for something steadier than chaos. His name was Heinrich Himmler, not a battlefield hero, not a fiery speaker, but a man who believed the world could be rebuilt through rules, ritual, and obedience. Himmler came of age in a nation breaking apart. Inflation turned paychecks into paper. Governments rose and fell like weather, and ordinary people searched for certainty wherever they could find it. He found his in the growing Nazi movement. At first, he was just another loyal party worker, watching closely how slogans became belief and how belonging could be engineered. But his real fascination fixed on a small, almost ignored guard unit within the party, the Schutzstaffel, or SS. To most Nazis, it was a sideline. To Himmler, it looked like the beginning of a modern knightly order, disciplined, exclusive, and utterly devoted. Placed in charge of the SS in 1929, he began transforming it with chilling patience. Ancestry checks, black uniforms, solemn oaths, and a culture that rewarded absolute loyalty. Within a few years, this quiet administrator had built a state within a state. Tonight, we follow how Himmler's hunger for order reshaped Germany, and how the softest voice in the room can end up commanding the darkest machinery. You are watching Lullaby of Empires, a boy who worshipped order. Before Heinrich Himmler ever held power, before his name became welded to the darkest machinery of the 20th century, he was simply a boy in Munich, small, delicate, and quietly hungry for certainty. He entered the world on October 7, 1900, in a Germany that still believed in emperors, uniforms, and the authority of tradition. Bavaria, his home, carried a deep sense of old-world pride. The streets of Munich echoed with church bells and marching songs, and for many families the very idea of Germany meant discipline, obedience, and order, held together by faith and hierarchy. Himmler's family fit into that picture neatly. His father, Gebhard Himmler, was a strict schoolmaster, respected, formal, and convinced that order was the backbone of a good life. His mother, Anna, was quieter and more distant, affectionate in her own way, but never indulgent. Their home ran on routine, meals at fixed times, prayers repeated in steady rhythm, proper manners, proper posture, proper expectations. If the world could be shaped by rules, Gebhard Himmler intended his sons to live by them. Heinrich was the middle child. His older brother, Gebhard Jr., was stronger and more confident. His younger brother, Ernst, was lively and healthy. Heinrich was not. From early childhood, he struggled with fragile health, often sickly, often exhausted, often watching rather than joining. In a culture where boys were expected to be robust, competitive, and physically confident, his frailty left a quiet bruise on the inside. It didn't make him rebellious. It made him inward. He learned early that if he couldn't dominate a playground, he could master a notebook. If he couldn't impress others with strength, he could impress them with precision. Teachers described him as obedient and diligent. He wasn't the most brilliant student in the room, but few matched his almost stubborn commitment to doing things correctly. Where other children rushed, he measured. Where they improvised, he planned. Where they played loud games, he studied patterns. He kept careful diaries from a very young age, records of school events, family life, small observations about the world. His handwriting was clean, almost ceremonial. His notes were methodical, detailed, and oddly self-disciplined for a child. If you imagine a boy who found safety in neat columns and certainty in schedules, you are close to the young Himmler. Even as a schoolboy, he gravitated toward the rituals of authority. He loved parades, less for their excitement and more for their precision. The neat lines of marching men, the unity of their voices, the predictable shape of a ceremony where everyone knew their place. It seemed to him like harmony made visible. It promised that chaos could be tamed if only people followed the proper rhythms. In Munich, he saw that rhythm everywhere. Catholic life added another layer of order: the prayers, the repetition, the solemnity of Mass. These were systems in themselves. Himmler absorbed them not only with faith, but with the fascination of someone who believed ritual could hold a world together. Religion didn't just comfort him. It trained him to believe that obedience was sacred. His imagination, however, reached further back than Catholicism. Like many German schoolboys of the era, he read stories of medieval knights and ancient warriors. But Heinrich didn't read them for adventure alone. He read them as models. The Teutonic Knights in particular captivated him. Men bound by vows, living in disciplined brotherhood, serving a mission larger than themselves. In those stories, he found something he didn't feel in his own body: a way to become strong through belonging. Knighthood, in his mind, was not about reckless bravery. It was about structure. It was about loyalty. It was about being part of an order that demanded sacrifice and repaid it with identity. That ideal sank into him deeply. He began to picture life not as a battlefield where the strongest survived, but as a hierarchy where the most faithful rose. A quiet boy could become powerful, he thought, if he served the right system. As he grew into adolescence, the world around him shifted in ways he could not control, and that only made control more alluring. Germany, before 1914, still carried imperial confidence, yet the modern world was pressing in. Cities expanded, industry grew, social tensions simmered. The old certainties that Himmler admired were no longer as stable as they appeared. But he didn't interpret this as an invitation to freedom. He interpreted it as a warning. The more unpredictable the world seemed, the more he longed for something firm enough to shape it. In school, his strengths remained quiet ones. He was conscientious, serious, restrained. He didn't charm classmates, he didn't lead games. If there was a boy who practiced a salute until it was precise, or memorized rules until they became instinct, it was him. His mind did not leap in creative bursts. It built itself slowly, brick by brick, and each brick was labeled loyalty, discipline, and order. When the First World War began in 1914, he was only 13, too young to join, and too physically weak to be likely accepted even when older. Yet the war consumed his attention anyway. He followed it like a scholar. He read newspapers carefully, noted battles, recorded the movements of armies. In his diary, the war became almost ceremonial, an immense national ritual of sacrifice that he watched from a distance. Many boys of his generation romanticized the war. Himmler did too, but in his own way. It wasn't the roar of battle that thrilled him. It was the idea of devotion, the thought of men who surrendered themselves to a cause and found meaning in obedience. To him, the uniform was less about violence and more about belonging. He dreamed of joining as an officer one day, not because he sought bloodshed, but because he craved a role in a structure that seemed sacred. But history moved faster than him. By the time he was old enough to train, the war was already collapsing. Germany's defeat in 1918 did not arrive to Himmler with the noise of shells or surrender ceremonies. It arrived in silence. The emperor was gone. The old order had broken. Veterans returned bitter and wounded, their faces older than their years. The streets of Munich felt unstable, full of anger and poverty and whispers of betrayal. To many Germans, defeat felt humiliating. To Himmler, it felt personal. He had never fought, he had never proved himself. The war had ended before he could find his place in it. Instead of being a heroic memory, it became a door that closed in his face. His unfulfilled longing did not fade, it sharpened. His sense of weakness did not dissolve, it found a target. Versailles, for him, was not merely a treaty. It was a symbol that Germany had been robbed of dignity. The republic that followed seemed chaotic and fragile. And in that fragility, Heinrich Himmler saw the worst possible fate, a world without structure. Munich, in the early post-war years, was a charged city. Political movements clashed openly. Economic collapse drove desperation into households. Former soldiers gathered into paramilitary groups, wearing uniforms once more as if they could rebuild the empire by force of will. People spoke of enemies within, enemies without, traitors, conspiracies. Some of it was fear, some of it was propaganda. But to a young man who had always sought order, these voices sounded like clarity. He listened, quietly at first, attentively always. University offered him another kind of structure, and he chose agriculture. It was not an odd choice for him. Farming represented discipline, predictable cycles, and a connection to land that felt timeless. He imagined Germany's renewal not in factories or parliaments, but in fields and villages, blood tied to soil, tradition planted into future harvests. He studied farm yields and stock breeding with real diligence, believing that the countryside carried an unbroken purity the modern city had lost. But even there, ideology slipped into his studies. He began reading widely: history, politics, racial science, nationalist pamphlets. Germany was full of angry explanations for defeat, and Himmler absorbed them the way a thirsty man absorbs water. Among the most poisonous ideas circulating in those years were anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, claims that Jews were responsible for Germany's collapse, that history was a struggle of bloodlines, that national rebirth required cleansing. Himmler did not invent these ideas. He inherited them from a culture already sick with them. But he received them with a particular intensity. They offered him what he most craved: a simple, ordered map of the world. Chaos, they said, was not random. It had a cause. Weakness, they said, was not fate. It had enemies. Germany, they said, could be rebuilt through discipline and purity. To someone like Himmler, that sounded less like hatred and more like structure. A grim structure, but structure all the same. While others debated loudly, Himmler transformed belief into private certainty. His diary entries from these years are revealing. Careful, restrained, never theatrical, but increasingly sure of a worldview built on hierarchy and racial myth. He was becoming, in slow motion, exactly what he had always wanted to be. Someone whose obedience to an idea made him strong. He was still not charismatic. Still not physically imposing. Still not the sort of man you would point to in a crowd and say, "There goes the future architect of terror." But the foundations were already forming. His health continued to matter. It kept him from direct combat. It kept him from rough, spontaneous living. Yet it also pushed him into the kind of life where power could be exercised through organization, paperwork, and systems. Where men who lacked battlefield dominance could still dominate institutions. He began to admire not only soldiers, but administrators. Not only fighters, but people who could command through knowledge and structure. If medieval knights were his childhood dream, then the modern bureaucratic state was becoming his adult canvas. By the early 1920s, Heinrich Himmler was a young man of 22 with a fragile body, enormous discipline, and a mind increasingly captured by the promise of national rebirth through purity and obedience. He wasn't famous yet. He wasn't powerful. In many ways, he was almost invisible. But invisibility for Himmler was never weakness. It was preparation. He had learned to watch and memorize. to move through systems rather than against them, to find strength in belonging to something larger. The more Germany fell into chaos, the more he believed only a strict new order could save it. And somewhere in the political storms rising over Munich, he sensed a movement forming that might finally offer him what he had sought since boyhood. A disciplined brotherhood, a mission cloaked in destiny, and a structure sturdy enough to erase his own doubts. In that quiet, waiting hunger, behind the neat handwriting, the careful diaries, the soft voice, lay the first shape of the man he would become. A boy who worshipped order, a young man who feared chaos, and soon a believer who would turn obedience into a weapon. We'll pick up his story there, at the moment when longing meets opportunity, and the private world of a quiet Bavarian student begins to merge with the movement that will change Europe forever. Drawn into the Storm, 1919–1923. When the war ended, it did not end softly. For Germany, 1918 was not a punctuation mark. It was a tear in the fabric of the world. The empire collapsed, the Kaiser fled, and what replaced the old order was not peace but a nervous, trembling experiment called the Weimar Republic. To many Germans, it felt like waking up in a country that no longer belonged to them. For Heinrich Himmler, now a young man hovering at the edge of adulthood, this was the kind of chaos he had been raised to fear. Munich, his city, became one of the most volatile places in Europe. Soldiers returned home, angry and unemployed. Factories slowed, hungry families lined up for bread, and political groups of every shade battled for the soul of Germany. Street fights between communists and nationalists were common. Flags changed overnight. Governments rose and fell like weak men trying to stand in a windstorm. It felt to Himmler that the country had lost its spine. He wrote about this period in his diary with the tone of someone trying to understand a world he could no longer trust. The language of his entries grew sharper, more anxious. His longing for order was no longer a private preference. It was becoming a political need. In a society unraveling under inflation and humiliation, order began to look like salvation. He entered university in 1919, studying agriculture in Munich and later at the Technical University. Agriculture was a disciplined science, rooted in cycles and measurable outcomes. But it was also tied to a deeper ideal that was spreading through nationalist circles: blood and soil. The countryside, they argued, was the pure heart of Germany, unbroken by modern decay, protected from foreign influence, preserved by tradition. Himmler took this idea seriously. Farming represented more than crops. It represented continuity, ancestry, and a fixed place in the world. Even as a student, he joined youth and veterans networks that shared these beliefs. One of the most important was the Freikorps, groups of ex-soldiers who formed paramilitary units to fight communist uprisings and protect conservative interests. Himmler didn't become a frontline brawler. His health and temperament didn't fit that role, but he was present in the orbit of these movements, drawn to their uniforms, rituals, and promises of national rebirth. The Freikorps' world was full of men who felt cheated by history. They believed Germany had not truly been defeated. It had been betrayed from within, by politicians, by revolutionaries, by Jews, by un-German forces that had poisoned the nation. These were common myths in post-war Germany, and they were spread in taverns, on street corners, in newspapers, and in underground pamphlets. Himmler was not a man who shouted these myths at crowds. He absorbed them quietly. Where others raged publicly, he read privately. He collected nationalist literature, studied lists of political enemies, and kept notes on speeches he heard. He was building a worldview, slowly, carefully, like a house with locked doors and strong beams. Inflation made everything worse. By 1921 and 1922, the German mark was collapsing. savings evaporated. Middle-class families who had once felt secure were reduced to panic. People carried wheelbarrows of cash to buy a loaf of bread. Every week, the price of life climbed further out of reach. For someone like Himmler, who craved predictability, this economic madness felt like proof that liberal democracy was not merely weak, but dangerous. The Republic seemed incapable of protecting its citizens. It argued, it compromised, it delayed, and in Himmler's mind, compromise was what had already ruined Germany once. If order could not be found in politics, it must be rebuilt through a new force. That was the conviction spreading through nationalist circles, and Munich, spiraling in volatility, was where that force began to gather. In 1923, the situation exploded. France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr to enforce reparations. Passive resistance and strikes deepened economic collapse. The government printed money at a frantic rate, accelerating inflation to insanity. Bavaria became a hotbed of nationalist plotting, and Munich was filled with men who dreamed of marching on Berlin to overthrow the Republic. This was the year Adolf Hitler first stepped onto the stage of history. Himmler had heard the name before. By 1922, Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party, still relatively small, were becoming louder and more visible. Their rallies were theatrical, their slogans simple, their anger constant. The Nazis promised order, unity, revenge against Versailles, and the restoration of German pride. To a restless country, it sounded like rescue. To Himmler, it sounded like belonging. He began attending Nazi gatherings that year. At first, he was only one quiet face among many. He did not immediately join with the zeal others did. He watched, he listened, he evaluated. His mind, trained by years of discipline and observation, moved cautiously. But the message aligned with what was already forming inside him. The Nazis offered a world where chaos had clear enemies, where discipline was holy, where loyalty was not negotiable but sacred. They spoke of cleansing Germany, of purifying society, of rebuilding the nation through strength and obedience. Their rallies were more than speeches. They were rituals. There were banners, chants, uniforms, salutes. Men moved together, not as individuals but as a brotherhood. For Himmler, these gatherings stirred something deep and old. They reminded him of the medieval orders he had admired in boyhood. The Nazis were not just a political faction, they were becoming a faith, with symbols that carried emotional force. He was drawn to that force like iron to a magnet. He officially joined the Nazi Party in August 1923. It was not an act of sudden passion. It was the quiet decision of a man who believed he had found a structure worth serving. His membership number, relatively low, suggests he was not late to the movement. Yet he remained in the background. He was not a street fighter. He was not a crowd leader. He was a loyal worker, eager to prove himself through reliability and detail. Within weeks of joining, he became involved in the party's paramilitary wing. The Nazis already had the SA, stormtroopers, a rough, brawling force that protected rallies and attacked opponents. But Himmler gravitated to something smaller, more symbolic. A tiny bodyguard unit dedicated solely to Hitler's protection. It was called the Stabswache, soon transformed into the Schutzstaffel, the SS. At that moment, the SS was insignificant. Only a few dozen men in cheap uniforms standing on the edges of Nazi rallies. The SA dwarfed them in power and size. Nobody looked at the SS and saw the future. Nobody except Himmler. He felt the pull immediately. This miniature unit had what he admired: exclusivity, ritual, discipline, and sacred loyalty. They swore oaths directly to Hitler. They stood in formation with a seriousness that went beyond politics. In their black caps and symbolic insignia, Himmler saw the first outline of a modern knightly order. This was not a practical attraction. It was psychological and spiritual. The SS offered him a stage where his lifelong dreams, structure, brotherhood, moral certainty, could become real. He began volunteering for SS duties while still finishing his studies. He did not rise quickly. He was still an outsider in many ways, quiet, methodical, not physically impressive. But the SS was also quiet and overlooked, and perhaps that is why he felt it was meant for him. In a world where loud men dominated the SA with fists and beer hall swagger, Himmler believed the SS could become something purer. Not a gang, but an order. His commitment deepened after the Nazi Party's first great failure. On November 8-9, 1923, Hitler attempted to seize power in Munich in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. The plan was to march on Berlin and overthrow the Republic. It was chaotic, half-baked, and doomed. Police opened fire on the marchers. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler was arrested. The party was banned. For most movements, this kind of catastrophe would have ended everything. Many followers panicked or drifted away. Others fell into despair. But Himmler processed the putsch differently. He did not view failure as proof of weakness. He viewed it as a test. He remained loyal through the ban, through the arrests, through the ridicule that followed. He continued his agricultural training, worked in farming jobs, and kept in contact with Nazi networks that survived underground. In his mind, loyalty was not dependent on success. It was a principle in itself. And in those years, the Nazis became for him less a political gamble and more a moral commitment. There was something almost monastic in the way he approached the movement. He didn't need immediate victory. He needed a structure to serve. He needed time, discipline, and belonging. The party's collapse did not shake him because he believed history unfolded slowly, and destiny required patience. This is a key point for understanding Himmler. He was not like Hitler, who thrived on theatrical momentum and sudden breakthroughs. Himmler was a builder. He measured time in plans, not performances. He believed the future was shaped by systems so carefully constructed that even failure could not destroy them. The ban on the Nazi Party was lifted in 1925, and Hitler rebuilt it. When the party returned legally, Himmler was ready. Not as a star, but as a man who had proven endurance. He rejoined immediately, throwing himself into organizational work. His quiet diligence began to attract notice. He took on small administrative tasks, paperwork, membership lists, logistics. These were the things he excelled at. And because the party was still chaotic and full of competing personalities, men like Himmler, steady, obedient, obsessive about details, were valued. The movement around him was growing again, shifting from a street cult into a national force. But for Himmler, the real focus was still that small black uniformed guard unit at the edge of rallies. The SS remained tiny. It remained under SA control. It remained irrelevant to almost everyone. Yet Himmler treated it like destiny. He studied its structure. He memorized its regulations. He imagined what it could become if shaped into a proper order. The SS, in his mind, could be the pure core of National Socialism, a disciplined brotherhood free of the SA's drunken brutality. He dreamed of a force selected not by brawn alone, but by loyalty and ideological purity. These ideas were still private, but they were beginning to harden into ambition. By the mid-1920s, Himmler had transformed from a fragile boy and anxious student into a quietly committed partisan of a radical faith. His worldview had crystallized. Germany was sick, chaos was deadly, and only disciplined purity could restore greatness. The Nazis offered him the language of that restoration. The SS offered him the instrument. He was still not a leader, but he was no longer just a follower. He had found the movement that matched the shape of his mind. And now, with patience as his weapon and loyalty as his identity, he stepped deeper into the storm, ready to turn a small, overlooked guard unit into the order that would one day define him and terrify the world. In the next chapter, we'll watch the quiet organizer rise, how Himmler's obsession with structure, ancestry, and ritual reshaped the SS from a forgotten bodyguard into the elite brotherhood at the heart of Nazi power. The architect of the Black Order, 1924 to 1933. In the mid-1920s, the Nazi Party was still a strange creature. It had survived the humiliation of the beer hall putsch, survived Hitler's prison time, and survived the ban that tried to bury it. But survival did not mean strength, not yet. The movement was rebuilding itself in beer halls, rented rooms, and overworked offices, held together less by power than by persistence. And in those rebuilding years, men like Heinrich Himmler began to matter. He was not the kind of man who seized a room. He didn't thunder from podiums. He didn't punch opponents in the street. There were others for that, loud men with scars, swagger, and fists. Himmler's strength was quieter, and it lived in things most people overlooked: paperwork, schedules, lists, procedures. He was a man who could sit for hours organizing names without boredom, who could memorize rules and repeat them as though they were scripture. Inside a movement that was still chaotic and often ridiculous, that kind of reliability looked like gold. After finishing his agricultural studies, Himmler tried briefly to settle into rural work. He took farming jobs, worked as a chicken farmer outside Munich, and spoke often of the soil with a kind of earnest reverence. But politics pulled him harder than potatoes ever could. The Nazi Party was expanding, and it needed administrators, men who could keep the machine running while the loud ones grabbed attention. Himmler fit that need perfectly. By 1925, the SS still barely existed. It was a tiny guard unit beneath the much larger SA, the street-fighting brawlers who acted as the Nazi Party's muscle. The SA was everything Himmler was not: rowdy, chaotic, swollen with men who cared more about fighting than discipline. They drank, they sang dirty songs, they terrorized political enemies, and they often embarrassed the party with their recklessness. Himmler watched them with unease. He respected strength, but he despised disorder. He believed a force built on impulse was a force that would eventually collapse. He wanted something different. A smaller body of men, tightly selected, strictly disciplined, and loyal in a way that felt almost religious. This was the seed of his future. He entered the SS formally in 1925 and quickly found that its insignificance was precisely what made it promising. A small unit could be reshaped. A neglected corner could become a foundation. Where others saw a side door, Himmler saw a cathedral waiting to be built. He was assigned to organizational work, the kind of work nobody wanted. He handled membership lists, helped oversee recruitment, and became involved in propaganda and logistics. In those early years, the SS was still under SA command, and its tasks were mostly ceremonial, guarding Hitler at rallies and providing a more disciplined public image when the SA was too unruly. Even so, Himmler treated this minor status like sacred apprenticeship. He studied how other orders in history were built. He read about knights, monks, and elite corps. He watched the psychology of ritual, how uniforms, flags, and repeated gestures could bind men together stronger than any paycheck. His mind was always sorting, classifying, imagining. The SS became his canvas. His first major step upward came in 1927 when he was appointed deputy leader of the SS under Erhard Haydn. It was not an appointment made because of charisma, but because of diligence. Himmler was already known as meticulous to the point of obsession. He wrote letters in perfect structure. He issued instructions that left no ambiguity. He treated loyalty like oxygen. Haydn, however, was a fragile leader, capable but uncertain, and increasingly unpopular with Hitler. By 1929, Hitler wanted the SS to become something cleaner and more reliable than the SA. Haydn was removed, and Himmler was promoted to lead the SS. He became Reichsführer SS in January 1929. When Himmler took command, the SS numbered only a few hundred men, barely visible beside the SA's tens of thousands. The SS did not yet have the aura of terror history would later attach to it. It was still the party's quiet shadow, a decorative guard unit whose future seemed limited. But Himmler did not believe greatness depended on numbers. He believed greatness depended on selection. From the very beginning, he treated the SS not as a crowd, but as a cult of the chosen. His first aim was to separate it psychologically from the SA. The SA recruited broadly. Any angry nationalist male could join. Himmler wanted the opposite. He wanted fewer men, but men who saw themselves as different. So he began to tighten entry requirements. Recruitment was slow and deliberate. Applicants were screened for physical health, ideological loyalty, and most chillingly, ancestry. Himmler's racial obsession was already well developed. He believed Germany's future depended on purity, and he imagined the SS as the living proof of that purity. He required that recruits show genealogical records proving Aryan descent reaching back generations. He wanted men who looked the part but also carried the bloodline he idealized. To a modern viewer, this obsession seems grotesque and irrational, but to Himmler it was logical within his warped worldview. He did not see ancestry as a private matter. He saw it as destiny itself. This racial screening was not just bureaucracy, it was theater. Every SS recruit went through induction rituals designed to create a feeling of sacred belonging. The oath matters here. It was not simply loyalty to the party, but loyalty to Hitler personally. That distinction reshaped identity. If the party failed, loyalty remained. If Germany collapsed, loyalty remained. The SS man was to be loyal even beyond the life of the state, because loyalty was the state. Himmler understood something deeply human. Men will endure almost anything if they believe they are part of something eternal. He built the SS around that promise. He also reshaped appearance. Uniforms were standardized and turned into symbols. The black SS uniform, formally introduced in the early 1930s, was not chosen for comfort. It was chosen for impact. Stark, severe, almost medieval in feeling. It made SS men look like a separate caste, set apart from ordinary Germans and even from other Nazis. The skull insignia, Totenkopf, and runic symbols fed the same purpose, to create an identity that felt older than the Republic, older than modern politics itself. With every symbol, he was telling his men quietly, "You are not like the rest." And that difference bred pride. Soon, Himmler began expanding the SS not through wild recruitment, but through precision. He established regional formations, structured files, and created a hierarchy that rewarded obedience. Promotions were tied to reliability first, ideology second, and charisma last. Himmler did not want another SA, he wanted an engine. To keep his men focused, he instituted relentless discipline. Training emphasized physical endurance, drill, and ideological study, but more importantly, it emphasized ritual. Ceremonies, torchlight marches, commemorations of Nazi martyrs, these were not optional public theater, they were emotional glue. They made men feel that SS membership was not a job, but a calling. He spoke to SS officers like a priest speaks to novices. His tone was calm, his language full of duty, sacrifice, and destiny. He wanted them to live SS identity even off duty, clean personal habits, orderly family lives, and lifestyles that reflected purity. He criticized drunkenness and disorder, not because they were immoral in the ordinary sense, but because they weakened the myth he was building. He was constructing a brotherhood, and brotherhood requires constant reinforcement. While Himmler reshaped the SS inwardly, Germany was tearing outwardly. The late 1920s were a time of false calm in Germany, until they weren't. In 1929, the Wall Street crash sent shockwaves across the globe. Germany, already fragile, was devastated. American loans vanished. Factories closed. Unemployment skyrocketed. The Weimar government, built on compromise, looked weaker with every month. Millions of Germans were desperate again, and desperation is fuel. The Nazi Party surged. It promised jobs, pride, unity, revenge, and restoration. Hitler's rallies grew larger, his public image polished. Electoral support climbed from a fringe movement to a national force in just a few years. The very chaos that made Himmler crave order was now lifting the Nazis toward power. Himmler understood this window. He wanted the SS to be ready, not only to protect Hitler at rallies, but to become the inner steel spine of the movement when it entered government. The SA could intimidate voters and break opponents, but the SA was too wild to be trusted with the machinery of state. Himmler knew that. Hitler knew it too. And so the SS became Hitler's insurance policy. In the early 1930s, Himmler also began building intelligence capability inside the SS. He was quietly fascinated with information networks, the same way he had once been fascinated with lists and ritual. He appointed Reinhard Heydrich, a former naval officer with cold intelligence, to create a service that would watch enemies inside and outside the party. This became the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD. It was a small office at first, almost invisible, but its purpose was enormous: to map German society through surveillance, reports, and political intelligence. Himmler believed that control required knowledge. The SD gave him a way to see more than others saw, and because Heydrich's mind was ruthless and systematic, the SD grew like a dark, nervous system inside the SS. This partnership, Himmler the architect, Heydrich the blade, would become one of the most lethal alliances in modern history. As elections rolled through 1930-1932, Germany edged closer to collapse. Street violence between Nazis and communists erupted daily. The SA fought openly. The Nazis made power look inevitable through noise and conflict. But beneath that noise, Himmler's SS was growing silently, like a skeleton forming inside a body. By 1932, the SS had expanded to over 50,000 men. Still smaller than the SA, but far more disciplined. And because the SS looked clean compared to the SA, conservatives and industrialists began to view it with grudging respect. The SS became the Nazi Party's face of order. That mattered. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. It wasn't a revolution at first. It was a political deal, stitched together by elites who thought they could control him. They had no idea what they were feeding. Once inside government, the Nazis moved quickly to dismantle democracy. After the Reichstag fire in February, emergency decrees crushed civil liberties. Communists and political opponents were arrested. The SA flooded the streets. The Nazi Party ran new elections under intimidation. By March 1933, the Enabling Act gave Hitler dictatorship by legal means. The state was now in Nazi hands. And Himmler, waiting in the shadows, moved immediately. Within weeks, he was appointed police president of Munich, and then head of the political police in Bavaria. This was his first real taste of state power, and it suited him like armor. Police work meant paperwork, procedure, hierarchy, observation, everything he understood. To Himmler, police control was not merely an office, it was an instrument. And because he had spent years creating a disciplined force of loyal men, he had the manpower ready. SS officials began taking positions in police departments. Arrests were carried out calmly, systematically. Early concentration camps were established to hold political enemies. These camps were brutal, but still in an experimental phase, more improvised terror than industrial machine. But Himmler was already learning something crucial. Terror works best when it is organized. In April 1933, Hermann Göring created the Gestapo in Prussia as a political police force. It was an aggressive tool, but Göring was more interested in spectacle and wealth than in building a lasting system. Himmler's mind, by contrast, was systematic. He looked at the Gestapo and saw the same thing he had seen in the SS years earlier, a small tool with massive potential. By 1934, he would begin absorbing it into his empire. But even in 1933, the direction was clear. Himmler was no longer just building a brotherhood. He was embedding his brotherhood into the state. The SS had arrived not by storm, but by silence. By the end of 1933, Heinrich Himmler stood in a position that would have stunned the nervous student of 1919. He led a growing elite order. He controlled police power in key regions. He had built an intelligence service that saw the nation through files and fear. And he had done it without ever being the loudest man in the room. That was his style. He was the kind of man who did not conquer by spectacle. He conquered by structure. The SA still swaggered bigger and louder, and its leader Ernst Röhm dreamed openly of replacing the traditional army with his rowdy stormtroopers. But that dream put Röhm on a collision course with Hitler, and gave Himmler the opportunity he had quietly prepared for. Because in every dictatorship, there comes a moment when the leader must choose between chaos and control. Hitler would soon make that choice. And Himmler's SS, disciplined, myth-soaked, loyal to the bone, would be ready to step out of the shadows and become the black engine of Nazi rule. In the next chapter, we'll follow the decisive turning point, the internal Nazi purge known as the Night of the Long Knives, where Himmler and the SS helped destroy the SA's power and emerged as the new guardians of Hitler's Reich. Night of the Long Knives, 1934, when the SS rose in blood. By the spring of 1934, the Nazi revolution was winning, but it was also wobbling. Germany had not yet become a fully welded dictatorship. Hitler was chancellor, yes, and the Weimar Constitution had been hollowed out. Political enemies were being arrested. Newspapers were being silenced. The first concentration camps were already swallowing dissidents. But beneath the surface, two forces inside the Nazi movement were pulling against each other like gears grinding out of sync. One was loud, hungry, and chaotic. The other was quiet, disciplined, and patient. The loud force was the SA, the brown-shirted stormtroopers under Ernst Röhm. The SA had been the muscle of the Nazi rise. Street battles, intimidation at polling stations, nightly marches, and constant violence against communists and liberals. Their numbers had exploded into the millions. Many of these men were unemployed veterans and working-class radicals who believed Hitler's victory meant a second revolution, one that would remake Germany socially and economically, not just politically. Röhm encouraged that dream. He was blunt about it. He wanted the SA to replace the traditional German army. He wanted a people's army under his command. He talked of sweeping away conservative elites, of pushing the revolution deeper, faster, and harder. And at times, he spoke as if he were Hitler's equal, perhaps even his successor. To Hitler, that was a threat dressed as loyalty. The German army, the Reichswehr, watched Röhm with alarm. So did industrialists, landowners, and conservatives who had supported Hitler only because they believed he would protect their world, not overthrow it. The SA's wild behavior was beginning to scare the very people Hitler still needed. And Hitler knew it. He also knew something else. The SA had become too big to control. Brown shirts were roughing people up without orders. They were clashing with police, seizing property, and continuing street violence even after Hitler publicly promised Germany order. Their swagger had turned into embarrassment. Their hunger had turned into a danger. Inside the Nazi movement, there was only one organization that offered Hitler a reliable counterweight: the SS. Under Heinrich Himmler, the SS had become a different kind of creature. Smaller, yes, but trained to be obedient, ideologically obsessed with purity, and organized with relentless order. Himmler had styled it as an elite brotherhood bound not to an idea alone, but to Hitler personally. It was the kind of organization that did not ask questions, it waited. And waiting was exactly what Himmler had been doing. For months, Himmler and his intelligence chief Reinhard Heydrich had been feeding Hitler a steady stream of reports about Röhm and the SA. Some reports were real, some exaggerated, some carefully shaped to push Hitler toward a decision. Heydrich's SD collected rumors, monitored conversations, and built files that painted Röhm as reckless and dangerous. There were even claims that Röhm was planning a coup. Historians today debate the scale of any real plot. Röhm certainly wanted power, but whether he planned a direct overthrow is unclear. What is clear is that Himmler and Heydrich understood how to turn suspicion into inevitability. They knew Hitler did not need proof. He needed justification, and Himmler was about to give him the perfect instrument. In late June 1934, Hitler made his choice. He would destroy the SA's leadership in a sudden purge, crushing Röhm's power and proving to the army and conservatives that he stood for order, not chaos. He would show Germany that he, and only he, commanded the revolution. The operation was planned quietly, like everything Himmler valued. Lists were drawn. Hotels and meeting sites were identified. SS and police units were positioned. The SD fed targets into the machinery. Orders moved in sealed envelopes and calm whispers. Then, on June 30th, the blade fell. At dawn, Hitler flew to Bavaria and personally confronted Röhm and other SA leaders at a resort in Bad Wiessee, where many were gathered for meetings. Röhm was arrested. So were dozens of senior stormtroopers. Across Germany, squads moved simultaneously, rounding up men whose names had been circled in red ink on Himmler and Heydrich's lists. Some were SA leaders, but not all. This purge was not only about the ESA. Hitler used the moment to settle other scores as well. Old rivals, critics, conservative enemies, and anyone seen as inconvenient could be swept away under the cover of restoring order. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher was shot in his home. Gregor Strasser, once a major Nazi rival, was killed. Journalists, politicians, and perceived threats vanished overnight. And the SS was everywhere in it. Himmler himself did not fire shots. That was never his style. His power was not in blood on his hands, but in blood flowing through his systems. He coordinated police forces, provided intelligence, and ensured the SS carried out arrests and executions with mechanical readiness. If the SA was chaos with clubs, the SS was order with bullets. Röhm was placed in prison and offered a pistol to kill himself. He refused. A short time later, SS men entered his cell and shot him. The leader, who had once swaggered beside Hitler, was dead, eliminated not in a public trial, but in a quiet room, under a cold order. By July 2nd, the purge was over. Officially, the Nazi regime admitted around 77 deaths. Unofficial counts suggest several hundred were killed. There would be no independent inquiry, no legal check. Hitler simply announced that he had acted to prevent treason. and Germany accepted it. Even more than accepted it, many applauded. The army was relieved. Conservatives were reassured. Ordinary citizens were told that Hitler had saved Germany from disorder. State radio repeated the phrase, "Night of the Long Knives," as if naming the violence could contain it. But for Himmler, the purge was something else entirely. It was the moment his SS crossed a threshold. Before that night, the SS had been the party's guard unit, still living under the shadow of the SA. After that night, the SS emerged as the Führer's sacred blade. Hitler rewarded Himmler lavishly. The SS was separated from SA command and became an independent organization directly responsible to Hitler. Its prestige rose overnight. Its black uniforms no longer looked ceremonial. They looked like the uniform of the regime's future. Himmler had achieved something enormous without ever shouting. He had helped to remove the movement's wild heart. And he had done it by proving the SS could kill calmly, precisely, and without hesitation. That ability became their passport to power. In the weeks that followed, Himmler's influence expanded far beyond what most Germans understood. He gained greater control over police and internal security. Heydrich's SD became more central, and the SS began growing not just in numbers, but in authority. This mattered because Hitler's dictatorship was not built only on public popularity or charismatic speeches. It was built on fear organized into institutions. Institutions needed men like Himmler. Men who could turn ideology into structure. Men who could make terror routine. It's important to understand how subtle Himmler's rise was. The Night of the Long Knives is often remembered as Hitler's purge, but it also marked the beginning of the SS as a state within the state. The SA had represented the street. The SS now represented the system. From this point on, Himmler's SS would not merely protect Hitler. It would define the regime's internal machinery. The purge also revealed something deeper about Hitler and Himmler's relationship. Hitler had learned that the SS would do what he needed without bargaining. Himmler learned that a man's position in a dictatorship depends on being useful at the moment of decision. He did not need to be loved. He needed to be indispensable. After June 1934, he was. The SS grew with the same methodical pacing Himmler preferred. Recruitment tightened further. Standards rose. Ideological training deepened. The SS began to see itself not simply as Hitler's guard, but as Germany's future ruling class, and Himmler nourished that idea. He spoke often of elite selection, of blood and loyalty, of an order that would outlast any individual. The SS was to be the new nobility, forged from discipline rather than inheritance. Every oath, every ceremony, every torchlit gathering now carried extra gravity, because the SS had proven itself in the one currency the regime valued above all else: obedience through violence. Meanwhile, the SA shrank into a hollow shell. It remained in existence, but its prestige was broken. It would never again rival Himmler's Black Army. So in a single weekend, Germany underwent a transformation. A dictatorship chose its internal master, and Heinrich Himmler, quiet organizer, lover of ritual and order, stepped into the role for which he had been preparing since the 1920s. This was not yet the Himmler of Auschwitz or the vast wartime SS empire. That darker future still lay ahead, but the mechanism that made it possible had just been tested and approved. Control through disciplined terror. From this night onward, the SS was no longer a guard unit. It was a political religion with guns, and its chief priest was Himmler. In our next chapter, we'll follow the reward that came directly after the purge. Himmler's takeover of German policing and the creation of a unified security state, where the SS, the Gestapo, and the machinery of surveillance merged into a single web that would soon reach into every German home, and later, across all of Europe. The police state becomes one web, 1934-1936. Himmler takes the keys. After the Night of the Long Knives, Germany did not simply lose the SA's wild power. It gained something colder, something quieter, something far more lasting. The Purge had shown Hitler two things that would shape the rest of the regime. First, that violence could be legalized after the fact with the right story, and second, that Himmler's SS could be trusted to deliver that violence without hesitation or ego. No drunken boasting, no street-level chaos, no demands for applause, just obedience. For Heinrich Himmler, that weekend in June 1934 was not the end of a struggle. It was the beginning of a takeover. The SS had proven its usefulness in blood. Now, Himmler intended to prove that it could run Germany from the inside out. And the door to that future stood inside one institution, the police. Before 1933, Germany's police forces were mostly regional. Bavaria had its own police. Prussia had its own, Saxony its own, and so on. They were tied to local governments, traditions, and laws. Even after Hitler became chancellor, the police remained fragmented, tangled in old Weimar habits. That fragmentation was a problem for a dictatorship. Himmler saw it with perfect clarity. A regime that wants total obedience cannot rely on scattered authority. A single hand must hold the keys. A single web must bind the country. One system, one rhythm, one master. So Himmler moved carefully, as he always did, quietly, methodically, through paperwork and appointments rather than speeches. His first major opening came in Bavaria. In April 1933, Himmler had already been appointed police president of Munich, and then quickly became head of the Bavarian political police. It was there that he absorbed an early lesson. A political police force doesn't need to be large if it's organized, feared, and backed by unlimited authority. Bavaria became his laboratory. The political police there soon included a new branch built from the Nazi imagination. The Gestapo, Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police. The Gestapo was not yet huge in numbers, but its design was revolutionary for tyranny. It existed outside normal legal constraints. Its agents could arrest without warrant, detain without trial, and interrogate without oversight. The Gestapo was a police force in a country where law no longer mattered. Himmler understood instantly what that meant. If he could spread this model beyond Bavaria, if he could merge the Gestapo into the SS worldview, then control of Germany would no longer depend on party rallies or propaganda. It would depend on daily fear, quietly maintained. And fear, once embedded into routine, is nearly impossible to uproot. But there was a rival standing between Himmler and that national web: Hermann Göring. Göring was loud where Himmler was quiet, flamboyant where Himmler was gray, impulsive where Himmler was calculating. And Göring controlled the largest state in Germany, Prussia. Prussia's police were the biggest in the country. If Himmler wanted to control Germany's entire security system, he needed Prussia. But Göring had already created his own Gestapo in Prussia in 1933, and he treated it like a personal weapon. For a time, the two men coexisted in tense partnership. Göring had raw political clout and Hitler's affection. Himmler had patient machinery, ideological ambition, and a growing SS empire. In this early phase, Himmler didn't try to fight Göring head-on. Instead, he waited. He watched Göring's Gestapo run hot, random arrests, clumsy corruption, the kinds of abuses that created noise and enemies. Himmler believed noise was weakness. He wanted the police to work like a clock, quiet, predictable, and terrifying because it never stopped. Over 1934 and 1935, Himmler slowly built alliances inside the regime, especially with the professional police bureaucracy. Many old policemen didn't love the Nazis, but they feared the SA and distrusted Göring's chaos more. Himmler offered them something they understood: hierarchy, procedure, stability, and power wrapped in legality. Then came another crucial factor: Hitler's own paranoia. Hitler wanted loyalty above all things. The more power he gathered, the more he feared betrayal. The SA had nearly frightened him into losing the army. Göring's swagger could be amusing, but it was not disciplined. Himmler, on the other hand, seemed to breathe loyalty. He did not seek attention, he sought structure. That was irresistible to Hitler. In April 1934, before the purge even happened, Hitler quietly appointed Himmler inspector of the Prussian Gestapo. That meant Göring had to share his prize. After the purge, Göring could not resist. He had backed Hitler's decision, but he had just helped destroy the SA, and now he had strengthened the SS's claim to be the regime's true guardian. By 1936, the waiting ended. Hitler made the arrangement permanent. Himmler was appointed chief of the German police under the Interior Ministry. This was one of the most important power shifts of the Third Reich, because it meant that the SS leader now controlled all police forces in Germany. Not just political police. All police. Uniformed police, criminal police, border police, and the Gestapo itself were united under Himmler's command. The state's coercive muscle had been handed to the SS. And Himmler did not treat this as an administrative promotion. He treated it as destiny. He reorganized German policing into two major branches: the Ordnungspolizei, ORPO, the uniformed police responsible for public order, patrols, and daily law enforcement; the Sicherheitspolizei, SEPO, the security police, including Gestapo, political police; Kriminalpolizei, Kripo, criminal investigation police. Above them all stood the SS. The police were no longer a separate institution. They were a functional extension of the SS order. This mattered in a practical way. Now, Himmler could coordinate surveillance, intelligence, arrests, and punishment through one chain of command. Reports flowed upward through SS officers. Orders flowed downward using SS discipline. No rival centers, no confusion, no local independence. Germany had been turned into a single security organism, with Himmler as the brain. To make this machine work, Himmler relied on the most dangerous mind he had ever recruited: Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich was younger than Himmler, sharper, more ruthless, and almost terrifyingly intelligent. Where Himmler was mystical and cautious, Heydrich was icy and direct. Himmler made grand ideological visions. Heydrich built practical systems to enforce them. Himmler placed Heydrich at the head of the SEPO and SD, turning him into the architect of the regime's intelligence and terror network. If Himmler was the spider, Heydrich was the venom. Together, they created a police culture that fused ideology with efficiency. A German policeman was no longer a neutral enforcer of law. He was a soldier of racial policy, trained to see enemies everywhere and to obey without empathy. Himmler wanted every officer to internalize a single truth: the state is not there to protect the citizen. The citizen is there to serve the state. And the SS defines what the state wants. How did that translate into daily life? Very quietly. That was the frightening part. The Gestapo did not need to be everywhere to feel everywhere. It was relatively small, far smaller than most Germans imagined. Its strength came from two things: unlimited authority and civilian cooperation. Himmler cultivated both. The Gestapo's legal power was simple. It answered only to itself. It could brand a person protectively detained and send them to a camp without trial. Judges could not interfere. Lawyers could not appeal. Families might not even know where someone was taken. That cold, legal void created a psychological earthquake. Because once a citizen realizes law no longer shields them, the safest strategy becomes silence. And silence spreads. But Himmler also used another tool even more powerful than legal terror: informers. He did not need a Gestapo agent on every street. He needed neighbors who believed there might be one, or who might report you to gain favor, or who feared you might report them first. Himmler's system encouraged denunciations. People wrote anonymous letters to police. They whispered rumors to local offices. They turned in co-workers for jokes, friends for skepticism, even family members for private complaints. This didn't only create fear, it created a society that policed itself. It was a web that tightened without Himmler having to pull every strand. And because it was built from ordinary human impulses, envy, fear, loyalty, opportunism, it was almost unstoppable. The traditional police had once been a public service. Under Himmler, it became an ideological blade. Criminal police began treating asocials as threats to racial health. Uniformed police were trained to align with Nazi concepts of purity and loyalty. The boundaries between police work and SS ideology dissolved. Many Germans barely noticed how fast it happened. The uniforms still looked official. The procedures still used stamps and forms. The offices still had desks and clerks. But now those desks served terror. Himmler loved that camouflage. He believed terror worked best when it looked like administration. Not rage, not chaos, forms, rules, lists. Because a system that looks routine doesn't feel like it can be resisted. It feels inevitable. And Himmler's quiet genius was building inevitability. One could see the transformation in small signs. A man dismissed for an offhand political remark. A pastor questioned for a sermon. A teacher reported for a skeptical comment about Hitler Youth. A neighbor vanishing after a late-night knock. It didn't always happen dramatically. Often, it happened with a file, a summons, a short arrest, a silent disappearance. The calmness was part of the control. Germany was becoming a country where fear lived not in grand spectacles, but in the daily expectation of being watched. By 1936, the SS was no longer a party faction. It was the nerve system of the Reich. Himmler had fused his Black Order into the state's bloodstream. The Gestapo and police forces now acted as one, knitting together surveillance, intimidation, and ideological control. This unification set the stage for everything to come. Because when war arrived, the regime already had the machinery to expand terror beyond borders. The system that controlled Germany could now be exported into Europe. With the police web secure, Himmler's next step was bigger still: to build an SS empire that included not just police and intelligence, but military forces, industries, farms, and eventually the entire concentration camp system on an unprecedented scale. In the next chapter, we'll follow how Himmler transformed the SS from an internal security order into a state within a state, an empire of uniforms, businesses, settlements, and armed divisions, preparing it for the coming war and for the dark reach it would exercise across the continent. Building an empire in black, 1936 to 1939, the SS spreads into everyday life. By the time Heinrich Himmler became chief of the German police in 1936, he had done something no one in the early Nazi movement could have predicted. He had taken a private guard unit, still small in numbers, and fused it into the nervous system of the state. The SS was no longer a symbol at rallies. It was the machinery behind the doors. And now that Himmler held police power in one hand and SS loyalty in the other, he began the next phase of his life's project, one far more ambitious than surveillance alone. He wanted the SS to become a world, not just an organization, a society, a state within the state, a black empire that could survive even if politics shifted, even if governments rose or fell, because it would be rooted in economy, land, families, schools, and a permanent sense of belonging. Himmler had always believed power lasted longest when it felt natural, when it was woven into daily routines, when people didn't experience it as rule, but as life. So he expanded the SS outward like roots, first into the economy, then into the countryside, then into homes, and finally into the future. Most dictatorships rely on loyal soldiers. Himmler wanted loyal soldiers who owned factories. Between 1936 and 1939, the SS began building its own business empire. At first, this growth looked harmless enough, purchasing small companies, operating workshops, expanding farming programs. But none of it was accidental. Himmler understood something simple yet chilling. A force that controls weapons is powerful. A force that controls money is permanent. So the SS created a wide network of enterprises, construction firms, brickworks, manufacturing plants, printing presses, and later even more complex industrial ventures. Some of these businesses served SS needs directly, producing uniforms, equipment, or supplies. Others existed mainly to generate wealth and independence. Their profits did not flow into the German treasury. They flowed into Himmler's SS world. This was not just greed, it was strategy. It meant the SS would no longer depend on the army for supplies, no longer depend on ministries for budgets, no longer depend on party leaders for survival. It would be self-sustaining, a parallel Germany built in black. Here, the SS economy crossed into something darker still. By 1936, Germany already had concentration camps. They were still relatively small compared to what would come later, mostly aimed at political opponents, undesirables, and people accused of undermining the regime. Himmler, however, did not view the camps only as prisons. He viewed them as labor reservoirs. Factories need workers. SS enterprises needed cheap workers who could not protest or refuse. The camps, under SS control, provided those workers. In this pre-war stage, forced labor was already becoming routine. Prisoners built SS facilities, worked in stone quarries, cleared land for SS farms, and produced goods for SS-owned industries. This was crucial to Himmler's empire. The SS would not simply police Germany, it would profit from Germany. And because the labor pool could be expanded whenever Himmler decided a new group belonged behind barbed wire, the system could grow without limit. The machinery of terror was becoming a machinery of wealth. Himmler's obsession with land had never faded. Even when he sat behind desks and files, he still imagined Germany's future in farms and settlements. To him, cities were unstable, crowded, too modern, too mixed, too unpredictable. The countryside, by contrast, felt eternal, orderly, pure. So he pushed the SS into agriculture with almost religious intensity. The SS bought farms, created agricultural estates, and founded rural settlements where SS families could live out a carefully shaped idea of German life. These were not normal villages, they were ideological colonies. New schools taught children SS values. Local administrations were staffed by SS men. Routines, celebrations, even farm layouts were designed to reinforce discipline, loyalty, racial ideology, and the idea that SS existence was sacred. Himmler believed that a man who owned land and raised children upon it would root the SS into the future far more deeply than a soldier who only marched and fought. So SS settlements became a kind of rehearsal for the world he wanted. A Germany of chosen families on chosen soil, guarded by SS law, fed by SS farms, and sustained by SS wealth. This is one of the strangest and most revealing elements of Himmler's mind. He did not believe the SS could survive on discipline alone. It needed blood. He wanted entire generations born into SS identity, so he made marriage and children part of SS duty. SS men were encouraged, sometimes pressured, to marry women considered racially suitable. They had to prove ancestry through detailed family records. Brides were evaluated for health, heritage, and ideological loyalty. The SS man was no longer just a soldier. He was a breeder of the Reich's future. Himmler promoted the idea of large SS families as a sacred responsibility. He built maternity homes, supported special programs for SS mothers, and publicly praised couples who produced many children. Even private life was SS territory. Children were raised not simply as Germans but as heirs to an order. They were trained in SS schools, SS youth programs, and SS culture. And in Himmler's dream, these children would become the next wave. Police, soldiers, administrators, settlers. A self-replacing elite. The SS wasn't meant to die out, it was meant to inherit Europe. While Himmler expanded the SS into business and farmland, he also expanded its inner religion. Because no empire survives on money alone. It survives on meaning. Himmler believed men obey best when they feel their obedience is sacred. So he wrapped the SS in rituals and ancient symbols. Runes became official SS emblems. Ceremonies were staged by torchlight. Oaths were treated like vows of faith. Birthdays of historical Germanic heroes became SS commemorations. Even funerals were designed to feel like ancient rites rather than modern burials. To outsiders, some of these traditions looked theatrical or bizarre. To Himmler, they were essential. He had always imagined the SS as a modern knightly order. Not in a romantic fairy tale way, but in a hard spiritual sense. Men sworn to purity, loyalty, and destiny, bound to something larger than themselves. If you give men the feeling they are chosen, you reduce the risk they will question orders. They will endure hardship. They will do terrible things thinking they serve eternity. So Himmler fed that feeling relentlessly. The SS was not told it served Germany. It was told Germany served the SS ideal. Himmler's empire needed more than farms and factories. It needed gates into the state itself. So he quietly placed SS men into civil offices, mayors, regional chiefs, police administrators, bureaucrats, and ministries. He did not always replace local leadership openly. Often, he inserted SS officers into key advisory roles. Once installed, they guided policy in SS direction, ensured cooperation with police networks, monitored local loyalty, and quietly brought entire regions under black influence. The effect was subtle, but cumulative. By 1939, many institutions that looked like normal government were already threaded with SS authority. To live in Germany was to live in a country where the SS stood behind almost every door that mattered. And the average citizen often wouldn't even know which decisions came from Berlin ministries and which came from SS offices. That was exactly how Himmler liked it. Invisible control is the strongest control. Then, in the late 1930s, Himmler expanded into a territory the army had always assumed belonged only to them. He built the Waffen-SS. At first, this force was small, almost experimental, but Himmler's ambition was clear from the start. He did not trust the traditional army fully. The army had loyalty to Germany, not to ideology. It had its own traditions, commanders, and pride. The SS needed weaponry that answered only to the SS worldview. So, Waffen-SS units were formed as elite combat troops, trained with extreme discipline and ideological conditioning. Their oath was not to the Constitution, not even truly to the German state. It was to Hitler as the symbol of SS destiny. Himmler insisted Waffen-SS men be both soldiers and believers. He wanted them tougher than the army and more ideologically pure than any other force in Europe. To Himmler, the Waffen-SS was not just a military tool, it was a guarantee. A loyal army he could take into the future, independent of generals who might hesitate later. By 1939, the SS had become something almost unprecedented in modern history. A private order that had turned itself into a national empire. It had police, intelligence, businesses, farms, settlements, schools, a growing army, and a prison labor system already fueling its economy. All of it tied to Himmler's vision. All of it loyal to Himmler's discipline. All of it ready to move beyond Germany. This is important to understand for what comes next. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and the Second World War began, Himmler did not have to improvise a new system of occupation. He already owned one. The SS empire he built between 1936 and 1939 was like a machine sitting in a garage, polished and humming, waiting only for the garage door to lift. War would lift that door, and the SS would roll out across Europe, not just with soldiers but with administrators, economic units, police networks, settlement plans, and a full ideological blueprint for reshaping human lives. The world was about to meet Himmler's dream in its most dangerous form. Because once that machine began moving across borders, it would no longer be confined to German streets or German prisons. It would become continental and eventually global in ambition. In the next chapter, we'll follow the SS into the first years of war, into Poland, then the West, and finally the Soviet Union, where Himmler's carefully built empire turned from control at home into a brutal system of occupation, resettlement, and the first steps toward mass murder on a scale the world had never seen before. War opens the door, 1939-1941. When Germany crossed the Polish border in September 1939, Europe heard the sound of armies moving. But beneath that noise, another force moved more quietly and with far deeper intent. Heinrich Himmler had spent the previous years turning the SS into a self-contained empire. Police, intelligence, industry, farms, schools, even a growing army. Now, war gave him what he had been preparing for all along: space, new land, new populations, new chances to reshape a continent according to the myth in his mind. Himmler was not a battlefield general. He did not ride at the front of tanks or shout orders in trenches. His kind of war was fought through paper, command chains, and ideology turned into procedure. While the Wehrmacht drove forward, the SS moved behind and alongside it like a shadow with a checklist. The invasion of Poland became the SS's first full-scale experiment in occupation. It was not only about winning territory. For Himmler, it was about organizing human life, sorting it, controlling it, redesigning it, and removing those he believed had no place in the future he imagined. To understand how quickly this happened, you have to remember what Himmler already controlled in 1939. He was Reichsführer SS, head of the SS. He also oversaw the German police, including the Gestapo and the criminal police. That meant in wartime he commanded both a military arm, the Waffen-SS, and a vast internal security and intelligence network. In Poland, these pieces aligned like gears. The SS could fight, arrest, resettle, and administer, all under one ideological roof. It was the first time Himmler could unleash his full machine outside Germany. From the very beginning, SS units followed the army into Polish towns with lists already prepared. Political leaders, teachers, priests, landowners, anyone seen as an obstacle to German rule were identified in advance. This was not chaotic violence in the heat of battle. It was organized repression, built on Himmler's belief that order required removal. Entire layers of Polish society were targeted for elimination or imprisonment. because the SS view of occupation was not to manage a conquered people, but to break their leadership and remake their future. If that sounds chilling, it was. Himmler believed that history was a contest of bloodlines. In his eyes, war was an opportunity to cleanse territory and repopulate it with those he considered racially valuable. He called this program the reorganization of the East. But behind the soft language was a brutal idea. Millions of people could be uprooted, relocated, enslaved, or killed as a matter of administrative planning. And because Himmler had already built a bureaucracy of terror at home, he knew exactly how to scale it up. In occupied Poland, the SS set up ghettos for Jewish communities, isolating them from the wider population and forcing them into tight zones under constant control. These ghettos were not yet extermination camps, but they were a crucial step in the machinery of persecution. They centralized people, made them easier to monitor, and stripped them of rights and resources. Hunger, disease, and overcrowding spread rapidly. For the occupying SS leadership, it was all framed as policy, not cruelty, another example of how Himmler's mind separated human suffering from administrative purpose. When men are reduced to entries in a registry, decisions become easier to justify on paper. At the same time, the SS began deporting Polish families from land it wanted to Germanize. Homes were emptied, farms taken, regions reclassified. German settlers, often SS families, were moved into those spaces. Himmler saw it as a historical correction, a return of German blood to German soil. It was the blood and soil fantasy he had nurtured for years, now put into motion behind the shock of invasion. In some villages, people were given minutes to pack what they could carry. In others, deportations came at night. The process was systematic. Trains scheduled, property cataloged, new settlement maps drawn. The cruelty was immense, but it wore the mask of routine. The SS also established new concentration camps in Poland, expanding the system that had begun in Germany. These camps served multiple purposes. They imprisoned those labeled enemies, they provided forced labor, and they anchored SS authority in occupied territory. The camps were not only places of terror, but administrative hubs, nodes in a growing network Himmler could control from afar. For SS officials, the presence of a camp meant power could be enforced without negotiation. The camp was the visible edge of an invisible system. Himmler visited Poland soon after the conquest. His tours were not the emotional inspections of a soldier seeing battle. They were the cold evaluations of an architect checking construction. He met with SS commanders, reviewed reports, discussed settlement plans, and examined the progress of his racial policies. Witnesses noted his calm demeanor, almost scholarly, while he observed destruction and displacement. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of Himmler's character. He could stand amid catastrophe with the quiet focus of a man reviewing a blueprint, because in his mind, catastrophe was not failure. It was the necessary cost of redesign. But Poland was only the first chapter of his wartime expansion. In 1940, Germany turned west. The invasions of Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France followed in rapid succession. Again, armies moved first. Again, the SS followed. Yet Western Europe posed a different challenge. These societies were more urban, more internationally visible, and in many cases considered racially closer to Himmler's ideal. His approach there was more strategic than openly brutal. The SS established security networks, hunted resistance leaders, and inserted itself into police structures. In France and the Low Countries, Himmler's machine learned something vital. Occupation needed to look orderly to survive. Fear was stronger when it came in neat uniforms and stamped documents rather than constant gunfire. This is where the Gestapo and SS security services, under Himmler's broader authority, spread like ink through European cities. Informant systems were created. Local police were pressured or reorganized. Registration requirements multiplied. People were watched without knowing when or by whom. Himmler's genius, if that word can be used in such a context, was his belief that terror works best when people feel it might be everywhere. He preferred the quiet threat of surveillance to the loudness of continuous violence, because surveillance reshapes behavior. It makes ordinary life careful, and careful life is obedient life. While his Western occupation tightened, Himmler's real obsession remained the East. The West, in his eyes, was valuable territory. The East was destiny. It was the space where his racial empire was supposed to be built. And in 1941, he got his chance. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, began in June 1941. It was the largest military assault in history to that point, stretching across thousands of miles. Hitler sold it to Germany as a war of survival against Bolshevism. Himmler saw it as something even bigger: a racial war, a civilizational war, a chance to seize vast lands and reshape them forever. Before the army even crossed the border, SS Einsatzgruppen, special mobile killing units, were ready. Their mission was not battle, it was extermination. They followed the army into Soviet towns and forests, rounding up Jews, political commissars, and others labeled threats. Men, women, and children were shot in mass executions, often in ravines and fields, their bodies buried in pits. This was not a secret side effect of war, it was policy. Himmler approved it, supervised it, and received reports documenting it in cold, bureaucratic language. Numbers, locations, operations completed. Human lives reduced to tallies. If that detail is painful to read, it should be, because it marks the moment Himmler's empire crossed into a new stage: systematic mass murder as an operating function of the SS. The killings in the Soviet Union were a horrifying bridge between earlier persecution and the industrial genocide that would soon follow. It is important to say clearly what was happening, without euphemism, because Himmler himself always wrapped violence in sterile language. He spoke of security, resettlement, cleansing, special measures. The reality was murder on a scale that almost defies human comprehension. Himmler visited the Eastern Front soon after the invasion. In one widely documented episode, he witnessed a mass shooting near Minsk. Accounts suggest he looked shaken momentarily by the immediacy of the bloodshed, yet he did not stop it. Instead, he began pressing for methods he believed would be more efficient and less psychologically damaging for SS men carrying out the killings. This is another deeply revealing window into his mind. He was not disturbed by the moral horror. He was disturbed by the logistical and emotional strain on his own personnel. In his view, the mission was correct. The problem was method. From these concerns grew a push for killing processes that were more removed, more systematic, and easier to scale. The SS began using gas vans, trucks sealed so that exhaust fumes could kill those inside. It was, in Himmler's mindset, a technological solution to a bureaucratic task. Again, the pattern is clear: organization over conscience, procedure over humanity. At the same time, Himmler's settlement and labor visions expanded across Soviet territory. Millions of prisoners of war were captured. Many starved or worked to death under brutal conditions. Forced labor programs swelled. Regions were mapped for future German colonization. The SS built new camps, expanded old ones, and tightened control through police networks. The East was becoming a vast laboratory for Himmler's empire. Every report he received fed his belief that destiny was unfolding as planned. Yet, even in these early months, reality was already pushing back. The Soviet Union did not collapse quickly. German supply chains stretched thin. Resistance grew. Weather, terrain, and distance undermined the neatness of Himmler's vision. But those problems were still on the horizon. In 1941, the SS machine was ascending. It was spreading with terrifying momentum, carried by the war the way a river carries a ship downstream. By the end of 1941, Himmler had achieved a kind of power he had only imagined in the 1920s. He controlled internal security in Germany. He commanded a growing elite army. He administered camps and labor networks. And now, through occupation policy and mobile killing units, he was shaping the human map of Europe in a way no police chief in history had ever done. His empire was not only political or military, it was demographic. It reached into who could live where, who could own land, who could have rights, and who could survive at all. He had built a world where ideology moved through paperwork as naturally as blood through veins. Orders written in calm offices translated into empty villages, crowded ghettos, mass graves, and railway cars moving east. The SS did not need Himmler to shout. It only needed him to sign. The system he had created was now strong enough to operate almost automatically, and that is what makes this stage so critical. Poland and the Soviet Union were not just the SS following war. They were proof that Himmler's long project had reached full function. His structures could now expand over borders. His police logic could now govern foreign populations. And his racial ideology, once theory, had become routine. In the next chapter, we'll watch that routine harden into something even more organized and more lethal. Because after 1941, Himmler and the SS would no longer rely mainly on shootings, ghettos, and improvised terror. They would turn toward a far colder system, industrialized genocide, carried out in camps designed not for imprisonment or labor alone, but for mass killing. And it is there, in that terrible machinery of 1942 and beyond, that Himmler's empire reveals its fullest and darkest shape. In 1942, the SS crossed a line from which there was no return. The war had already given Heinrich Himmler vast territory, authority, and a roaming apparatus of terror. But what happened next was not simply an extension of earlier brutality. It was a transformation of murder into an industrial system. Himmler had always believed that ideology had to become structure to endure. Now, in the heart of a continent at war, he set out to make genocide a routine function of government. By the winter of 1941-42, the mass shootings carried out by Einsatzgruppen in the Soviet Union had killed hundreds of thousands of Jews and other targeted groups. Yet, even for Himmler's cold administrative mind, this method was messy, psychologically taxing on his men, and difficult to conceal as the war expanded. He wanted something cleaner, more systematic, and easier to scale. The solution, in his view, lay not in reducing the killings but in reorganizing them. In January 1942, senior Nazi officials met at a villa in Wannsee, Berlin, to coordinate what they called the final solution of the Jewish question. Himmler was not in the room, but every road in that meeting led back to his authority. The SS, through Himmler, was assigned the central role in implementation. The language of the conference was bureaucratic and chilling. It spoke of transportation, labor capacity, and administrative responsibility. It was genocide planned like a supply chain. That was exactly the world Himmler had built. Violence that could be carried out calmly because it was packaged as procedure. Himmler's influence was everywhere in those plans. He commanded the police forces that could arrest and deport. He controlled the camp system. He oversaw the Waffen-SS units that could operate in occupied lands. and he had already cultivated the ideological certainty needed to push men to do unthinkable things while believing they were dutiful. The architecture he created for control now became an architecture for extermination. To make this system run, Himmler needed camps designed primarily for killing. Concentration camps had existed since 1933, but their function had evolved: imprisonment, terror, forced labor, political control. In 1942, several sites in occupied Poland were transformed into extermination centers. This was the start of Operation Reinhard, named after Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's brutally efficient deputy who had been assassinated that year. Under this operation, camps such as Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were established or expanded with a singular purpose: mass murder. These camps were not vast labor complexes like some earlier sites. They were killing factories built for speed. Trains arrived, people were forced out, stripped of belongings and driven into gas chambers, often within hours. Bodies were buried, then later exhumed and burned to hide evidence. The process was deliberately designed to prevent chaos and maximize efficiency. For Himmler, efficiency was moral justification. If the machinery moved smoothly, he interpreted it as proof of correctness. He also pushed the expansion of Auschwitz-Birkenau into the largest and most infamous center of murder. Auschwitz had begun as a concentration camp for Polish prisoners, then expanded into a mixed labor and extermination complex. By 1942, Birkenau's gas chambers and crematoria were operating on a scale unprecedented in history. Here again, Himmler's dual obsession, order and ideology, took lethal form. The selection process on arrival was coldly systematic. Some prisoners were sent to forced labor. Most were sent directly to death. The act was framed as sorting, allocation, management, words that sounded administrative even as they concealed mass murder. Himmler visited Auschwitz in 1942. Witnesses described him inspecting facilities and observing operations with the same calm precision he had once used to evaluate SS barracks or settlements. He did not go as a grieving or conflicted man. He went as a supervisor checking throughput. He asked questions about capacity. He took note of how effectively the system was functioning. His presence reinforced to camp leadership that these operations were not rogue cruelty, but central policy. In Himmler's realm, nothing mattered more than alignment to the system. At the same moment, the SS needed a way to integrate genocide with wartime economics. Himmler's empire was hungry for labor. The war required weapons, construction, production, and repairs. Millions of prisoners, Jews, Poles, Soviets, and many others, were now being used as enslaved workers. In 1942, Himmler reorganized the camp system under the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office, known by its German initials WWII. This office, led by Oswald Pohl, turned camps into corporate nodes of forced labor. Prisoners were leased to SS-run enterprises and private German firms. Work schedules, quotas, and mortality rates were tracked like industrial metrics. This is one of the most disturbing contradictions of Himmler's system. On one hand, it aimed to exploit labor to the last breath. On the other, it aimed to exterminate entire populations. The way Himmler reconciled this was through hierarchy. Those he deemed temporarily useful could be worked to death, while those he deemed immediately useless could be killed on arrival. There was no moral tension for him. The categories were administrative, and once categories become routine, cruelty becomes routine too. Throughout 1942 and into 1943, deportation trains rolled from across Europe. Jews from Germany, Austria, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, Hungary, and beyond were pulled from homes, crowded into rail cars, and sent east. The SS coordinated these movements with railway timetables, police roundups, and camp capacities. It was the same bureaucratic web Himmler had perfected before the war, now stretched over a continent. It is hard to grasp the scale without picturing the ordinary planning that enabled it. Letters sent between offices, standardized forms, inventory lists of confiscated property, memos about train schedules. Genocide traveled inside the envelope of the everyday. Himmler understood that to keep this machinery running, his men needed a narrative that justified what they were doing. He had spent years building the SS as a quasi-religious order, steeped in myth and duty. Now he framed mass murder as a hard but noble burden. He told SS officers they were guardians of Germany's future, forced to do what others could not. This was not a slip of language. It was his deliberate strategy to fuse atrocity with identity. In October 1943, Himmler delivered a speech to SS leaders in Posen, Poznan. In it, he spoke openly about the extermination of the Jews. He described it as a difficult task that had been carried out decently, without becoming corrupt or weak. The speech is infamous because it strips away any pretense that the SS killings were accidental or unknown. Himmler was acknowledging genocide before an audience of his own commanders, praising them for their obedience and self-control. The logic was grotesque, yet consistent with his worldview. Moral greatness meant loyalty to the mission, not compassion for the victims. To older listeners today, that speech is one of the clearest windows into how a man like Himmler could function. He was not a wild-eyed murderer. He was a bureaucratic believer. In his mind, the SS had achieved something heroic, removing what he saw as a threat to the future. He understood the enormity, but he interpreted it through the lens of destiny and order. That is why the machinery could continue without him needing to scream. The ideology had become muscle memory. At the same time, the war was beginning to strain Germany's resources and confidence. Stalingrad had fallen early in 1943. Allied bombing was intensifying. The Eastern Front was bleeding the German army. Himmler reacted not by questioning his system, but by tightening it. He demanded more labor. He pushed camps to expand production even as mortality soared. Extermination through work, already a grim reality, became more explicit in practice. The human body was treated as fuel, consumed until emptied. This tightening revealed another aspect of Himmler's method. When reality pressed back, he did not change his ideology. He tried to force reality into ideological shape by reorganizing structures. If labor was short, he did not reduce goals. He increased forced labor. If resistance grew, he expanded police terror. If fronts collapsed, he demanded new SS units and new oaths. He could not imagine a world where order failed. He could only imagine order needing to be sharpened. Yet, even within the SS, cracks began to show. The very scale of genocide and forced labor created corruption, black market dealing, and disorder among some camp personnel. Himmler hated disorder more than almost anything. He issued investigations, punished certain officials, and tried to restore discipline. But the irony was brutal. A system built on absolute cruelty was also breeding moral rot. Himmler tried to control that rot with more rules, more inspections, more ritual. He acted as if the machinery could be purified by tightening its screws. There were also practical tensions with the regular German army. Himmler's SS was growing into a state within a state, competing for resources, recruits, and authority. Wehrmacht officers often despised SS interference, especially in occupied territories where SS racial policies destabilized supply lines and provoked resistance. Himmler responded with quiet persistence, placing more SS men in administrative roles and expanding SS police authority. He was building a parallel system even while Germany's military fortunes slipped. Through 1943, The camps reached their peak of scale and efficiency, but they also reached a peak of desperation, because Himmler could sense that time was tightening. He did not admit defeat publicly, but he understood the war was not unfolding as he had imagined. And when he felt pressure, his instinct was always to retreat into structures of belief. The SS rituals at Wewelsburg continued. The runes and myths remained his private anchor. He doubled down on the spiritual language of destiny because the practical world was no longer bending easily to his will. What makes this period so important is that it shows Himmler at the height of his power and the height of his delusion at once. The SS controlled enormous territories. The camp system and police networks reached into every corner of Europe. The Waffen-SS was fighting on multiple fronts, and behind it all was Himmler's quiet hand, guiding operations through paperwork, ideology, and administrative momentum. He had achieved the ultimate expression of his personality, a world where order itself executed his will. And yet that order was now devouring everything: victims, perpetrators, even the stability of the Reich. The more tightly Himmler tried to hold the system, the more it depended on constant expansion and constant violence to sustain itself. That is the nature of such regimes. They cannot survive on stillness. They need movement, targets, enemies, growth. When growth slows, the cracks widen. By the end of 1943, millions had been murdered in extermination camps and through shootings, starvation, and forced labor. Himmler's empire had become the central engine of the Holocaust. The man who once dreamed of a knightly order had forged something far darker. An order that treated human life as an administrative variable. He did not kill with a pistol in his own hand most days. He killed with signatures, schedules, and the calm certainty that murder could be managed. This chapter of the story is hard to sit with. It should be. But to understand Himmler honestly, we must see him here, not as a caricature of evil, but as a real human being who used routine, discipline, and ideology to enable unimaginable destruction. That is what makes his legacy so chilling. The machinery he built did not require madness to run. It required obedience, paperwork, and men who believed destiny made them righteous. In the next chapter, we move forward into 1944, when the war's pressures force that machinery into crisis. The SS expands further even as the Reich begins to buckle. Himmler will chase both control and salvation, tightening his grip while exploring stranger, more desperate paths. The calm architect of terror will face the first true signs that his empire, built so carefully in silence, may not be able to endure the noise of collapse. The cracks in the fortress, 1944. By 1944, the empire Heinrich Himmler had spent 2 decades building was still vast, still feared, still wrapped in black uniforms and ritual certainty. But it was no longer growing into the future he had imagined. It was shrinking under the pressure of reality. The collapse did not come as a single dramatic moment. It arrived as a slow seep through the walls of his fortress. Shortages, defeats, muttering doubts, and a war that refused to obey his paperwork. For a man who believed order could shape destiny, 1944 was the year destiny began to slip out of his grip. The fronts were closing in. In the east, the Soviet army was driving westward with a momentum Germany could not stop. In the west, Allied forces had landed in Normandy in June and were tearing through France. The air war had turned German cities into smoking, shattered grids, and each bombing raid was a reminder that the Reich's machinery of control could not shield civilians from the weight of industrial war. Himmler read the reports every morning. He would have seen the numbers, the distances, the timelines. Yet, even as the maps narrowed, his instinct was not retreat, but tightening. If the world would not bend, he would try to clamp it into obedience. Inside Germany, the SS had become more deeply entwined with daily survival. Himmler's police empire, once a tool for reshaping society through terror, now had to help hold society together against collapse. He expanded surveillance with renewed intensity, hunting defeatism, desertion, and subversive talk. The Gestapo's reach had always relied on fear and informants, but fear works differently when people are starving and homeless. It no longer keeps them obedient out of awe, it keeps them obedient out of desperation. Himmler understood that. He responded by demanding ever harsher deterrence. Those accused of defeatist speech or resistance were punished quickly. Courts and investigations were streamlined, made more absolute. The system that had once thrived on an aura of unstoppable power now had to compensate for weakness by increasing brutality. For Himmler, escalation was not a sign of uncertainty, it was a duty. The camp system also changed under the new strain. By 1944, concentration camps had become not only instruments of murder, but a backbone of the war economy. Germany needed labor on a scale it could no longer provide through free citizens. Himmler's WWII and the SS industrial network pushed prisoners harder than ever. Factories close to the collapsing Eastern Front were evacuated, and surviving prisoners were marched westward to camps inside Germany. In these movements, the so-called death marches, the truth of Himmler's system was exposed in its rawest form. The prisoners were not moved to save them. They were moved to preserve labor power and to prevent the Allies from finding witnesses. Men and women staggered through snow and mud, shot if they fell. The marches were not chaotic accidents of war. They were the SS's planned retreat, order maintained through cruelty, even in defeat. At the same time, Himmler's obsession with racial purity did not weaken under pressure, it hardened. Even as the Reich faced annihilation, he insisted on continuing deportations and killings. Hungary was the last major Jewish community still largely intact in German hands, and in 1944 the SS launched a horrifyingly swift deportation campaign. In a matter of months, hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews were transported, mostly to Auschwitz. The scale was staggering even by the standards of the Holocaust. Himmler approved the machinery, enabled the rail timetables, and reinforced the ideological certainty of the SS men carrying it out. This was not an act of desperation alone. It was the continued unfolding of his long vision. If the war was being lost, the racial war had to be finished before it ended. That was his logic, cold and unbending. But within Himmler's own ranks, loyalty was no longer as seamless as it had once been. His SS, forged as a brotherhood of chosen men, had expanded beyond its original elite ideal. By 1944, the Waffen-SS had grown into a huge force with divisions filled by conscription as much as ideological zeal. Foreign volunteers and conscripts from across occupied Europe had been added to bolster numbers. Some were fanatics, some opportunists, some simply coerced. Himmler had always believed size mattered less than purity. Now, size was all he could get. The purity he worshipped was diluted by necessity, and that dilution quietly undermined the mystique he had built. He continued to insist on ritual, on oaths, on the sacred image of SS identity. But the war was now pulling men into the black uniform who did not share the old dream. The order was swelling into something less controllable. His relationship with the regular army grew even worse. The Wehrmacht, struggling on multiple fronts, viewed SS interference as a burden. Himmler could feel the contempt in many of their reports, though it was rarely stated outright. He responded by pushing SS authority deeper into the military sphere. He wanted to prove that his order could not only terrorize and administer, but fight and win. That ambition, so persistent in him, reached its most dangerous point in 1944 when Hitler handed him direct military command. Himmler was appointed commander of Army Group Upper Rhine after the Allies broke through into Western Germany late that year. To Himmler, it must have felt like the final validation of the fantasy he had harbored, that he was not merely an administrator, but a true war leader. Yet, on the battlefield, he was out of his depth. The front was fluid, supply lines shattered, communications chaotic. Himmler relied on staff maps and ideological confidence, but those did not substitute for experience. His orders often lacked practical grounding, and field commanders quietly adjusted or ignored directives that would have led to disaster. He was not an outright fool. He was diligent, disciplined, and convinced of his own method. But method without intuition and training becomes rigidity. Under him, the Army Group had no dramatic victories. It struggled to hold ground, and the Allies kept pressing. Even in failure, Himmler rarely admitted error in the way a practical soldier might. He interpreted setbacks through the lens he had always used: moral weakness, lack of ideological clarity, insufficient discipline. If a front collapsed, it was because men had lost faith, not because Germany's strategic position was hopeless. The language of destiny became his shield against reality, and because he was the architect of a system that worshipped obedience, few dared to contradict him openly. This is one of the deep tragedies of 1944. The more unreal Himmler's vision became, the more dangerous it was to argue with it. Meanwhile, his private world grew stranger. Himmler had long been fascinated by myths, runes, and sacred history. In 1944, those fascinations became more than decoration. They became refuge. He spent more time in ceremonial spaces, more time consulting occult readings, more time hunting for signs that history would bend back in Germany's favor. This was not a sudden turn into madness. It was a continuation of a worldview he had always carried, that blood and destiny governed outcomes. When the practical world fell apart, he leaned harder into the mystical one. To an outside observer, it may look like delusion. To Himmler, it was coherence, an attempt to restore meaning when the world no longer made sense. Wewelsburg, his castle of SS ritual, remained a kind of spiritual anchor. He still imagined the SS as an eternal nightly order, even as its barracks filled with exhausted conscripts and foreign recruits. He still believed symbols could hold men together, even as bombs fell and supply trains vanished. The contrast between his private imagination and the grinding chaos of the war was widening into a chasm. Yet he crossed that chasm daily with the calm stride of a man who refused to see it. By late 1944, the Reich itself was turning inward, more fearful of its own people than of its enemies. After the failed July 20th assassination attempt on Hitler, Himmler's police empire was unleashed on a massive scale. The SS and Gestapo hunted conspirators, suspected sympathizers, and anyone who could be framed as disloyal. Thousands were arrested. Many were executed after brutal interrogation or show trials. Himmler's system of terror, once aimed outward at racial enemies and occupied populations, now devoured German elites and officers. For Himmler, this purge was proof of his importance. He could present himself as the loyal guardian who protected Hitler from betrayal. But it also signaled how brittle the regime had become. A confident empire does not need to terrorize its own core. A frightened one does. Behind Himmler's steady face, there were hints of a more personal fear. He was a man who had built his identity on proximity to power and on the sacred myth of the SS. If that myth collapsed, what was left? Not only military defeat threatened him, moral reckoning threatened him too, even if he rarely named it that way. By 1944, he had helped construct a system of murder so vast that the world could not ignore it forever. He had always assumed victory would protect him. Victory would turn his crimes into history written by the winner, but defeat would turn them into judgment written by enemies. This tension began to shape his decisions. There are signs that in late 1944, Himmler cautiously slowed some deportations and killings, not from mercy, but from calculation. He was already thinking about the war ending, about what bargaining chips he might need, about how he might reposition himself if Hitler fell. He did not abandon the ideology, but the ideology was now sharing space with self-preservation. Himmler had always believed he embodied the Reich's future. Now, he began to imagine a future without the Reich. Yet, even as calculation crept in, his devotion to structure remained. The SS continued to export forced labor, to move prisoners, to enforce terror. The camps expanded deeper into German territory. New satellite labor camps sprouted near factories and mines. Himmler's WWII treated prisoners as inventory to be relocated, exploited, and discarded. In these last months of 1944, as the war turned decisively against Germany, the camp system did not slow. It intensified. The machinery of cruelty was so embedded in procedure that it could not simply stop. It moved forward because it had always moved forward. That is what Himmler had created, a system that did not require constant personal direction to keep killing. What began to change was the mood. For years, Himmler's calm authority had felt inevitable to his men, almost cosmic. Now, the inevitability was fading. Officers did not suddenly become humane. Most did not rebel, but they sensed the horizon narrowing. Some tried to hide evidence. Some tried to distance themselves. Some became more brutal, as if brutality could prove loyalty in the face of collapse. Others simply focused on survival. The SS order, once so confident in its mythic destiny, was now revealing a more ordinary truth: fear. Himmler read these shifts carefully. He still issued orders with measured confidence, still spoke of endurance and loyalty, still demanded ritual precision. Yet his empire was no longer the silent fortress of earlier years. It was a fortress with cracks. The cracks were not only at the fronts, they were in manpower, in morale, in the fading enchantment of ideology, in the exhaustion of a people whose cities were burning. Himmler did not respond by opening his mind. He responded by sealing it tighter. This is the essential shape of his 1944, expanding terror as the world contracted, leaning into myth as reality hardened, insisting on order while the very structures of order began to crumble. The more fragile his power became, the more absolute he wanted it to appear. And because he had built a system that worshipped his calm certainty, it continued to reflect certainty even when certainty was a lie. By the end of the year, Germany still fought, the SS still marched, and Himmler still held immense authority on paper. But the paper was burning. The Reich's walls were collapsing. The man who had once believed he could rule through silence and procedure now faced an enemy no memo could stop: time. The tide of war was no longer turning. It had turned, and in that turn, Himmler's world began its final descent toward the desperate, surreal choices of 1945, choices that would expose the last frightened core beneath the black uniform and the myths he had spent his life arranging. The last gamble, early 1945. The new year arrived without rescue. January 1945 did not bring the miracle Himmler had once trained himself to expect from destiny, nor the reversal his propaganda had promised to the German people. It brought only shrinking maps, collapsing fronts, and an exhaustion so deep that even fanaticism felt strained. The Reich was still standing, but it stood like a ruined cathedral with candles guttering inside, grand in outline, hollow in strength. Himmler, who had always thrived in systems that expanded, now found himself trying to manage a system that was dissolving. For a man who believed order could command the future, early 1945 was not just military defeat, it was philosophical defeat. Yet, he did not surrender to that truth. Instead, he reached for the one thing that had always guided him when the world resisted his plans: more control. And quietly, a new element: self-preservation. The Eastern Front was a catastrophe unfolding at speed. The Soviet winter offensives had smashed through German lines in Poland and East Prussia. Entire armies were encircled or shattered. Refugees streamed west in frozen columns, dragging carts and children through snow, fleeing from a Red Army that had become both conqueror and avenger. Himmler saw the reports. He saw the panic. He saw the collapse that no ritual could contain. Yet he framed it through the lens that had sustained him for years: weakness of will, lack of discipline, insufficient severity. The answer, in his mind, could never be less SS. It had to be more. He pushed SS authority deeper into the dying body of the state. In January, Hitler appointed him commander of Army Group Vistula, the attempt to patch together a defense of Berlin's eastern approaches. To Himmler, this was the ultimate proof that he was indispensable. But the appointment was an act of desperation more than trust. The Wehrmacht was broken. Its best commanders either dead, captured, or distrusted by Hitler after the July plot. Himmler was loyal in the ritual sense Hitler valued, and he controlled the strongest remaining internal police forces. That made him useful. It did not make him competent. The army group existed more on paper than on the ground. Units were incomplete, exhausted, starved of ammunition, and in places reduced to fragments pulled out of hospitals or training camps. Himmler tried to impose structure on chaos. He demanded neat reporting formats. He insisted on absolute obedience. He sent directives as if the front were a parade ground. But war in early 1945 was no longer a system that could be organized into compliance. It was a storm. His staff officers did what they could, often quietly in spite of him. Seasoned, generals learned to translate his unrealistic orders into something survivable. But the Soviet advance did not slow. Himmler's army group failed to hold the line, and within weeks it was clear to almost everyone, except perhaps Himmler himself, that he was not a battlefield savior. His illusion of command was now visible not only to the army, but to history. Yet it wasn't only the Red Army that cornered him. The Allies in the West were pushing into the Reich as well. The Ardennes gamble had collapsed. The Rhine was approaching. German cities were skeletal, their infrastructure smashed, their morale ravaged. Himmler's SS still enforced terror inside Germany, still executed defeatists, still hunted deserters, but the effect was diminishing. Terror works best when the regime looks unstoppable. In early 1945, the regime looked doomed. Fear remained, but it was mixed with resignation, and resignation is a kind of rebellion that no police network can fully arrest. Inside that unraveling, Himmler began to calculate in a new way. He had always been ambitious. He had always seen himself as the guardian of the Reich's pure future. But now, the future he had served was evaporating. He could no longer pretend that victory would cleanse and justify everything. He began to imagine another route. A future without Hitler, with himself somehow preserved. This was not a sudden betrayal born of conscience. It was the cold logic of a man who had always measured survival through structure. If one structure was collapsing, perhaps another could be built, one that left him standing at the center. The first signs were subtle. Himmler's rhetoric shifted. He still spoke of loyalty, still vowed obedience, still performed the rituals of SS devotion. But in private, he started to test a second line of thought. What if Germany could surrender to the Western Allies but continue fighting the Soviets? What if he could trade prisoners for negotiation? What if the SS could present itself as a force of order against Bolshevism, a useful tool for a post-Hitler Germany? These were fantasies layered with calculation. Yet fantasies can shape policy when a man has power, and Himmler still had power. His mind turned toward bargaining chips. Prisoners became currency in a way they had not been before. The SS began to discuss limited releases or transfers, not from mercy, but from strategy. Himmler authorized some exchanges through intermediaries, especially involving Scandinavian prisoners. He also allowed certain camp evacuations to proceed in ways that could later be framed as humane rather than murderous. But the overall system did not change its core drive. Death marches continued. Forced labor continued, killing continued. Himmler's adjustments were not moral pivots, they were hedges. At the same time, he sought contact with the West. The channels were secret, indirect, wrapped in the kind of bureaucratic discretion he knew so well. He used intermediaries, some diplomatic, some personal, hoping to reach British or American representatives who might listen. He framed his approach carefully: Germany's surrender in the West, cooperation against the Soviet Union, the SS as an anti-communist bulwark. In his head, this must have seemed plausible. He had spent years constructing myths. Now, he was trying to construct a myth of himself as a necessary ally. But the Allies did not need Himmler. They were not seeking compromise. They wanted unconditional surrender. They knew enough about the SS and the camps by early 1945 that any deal with the architect of those crimes would be both politically impossible and morally repellent. Himmler underestimated this. He had always lived inside a world where power could be negotiated through oaths and structure. He could not fully grasp that outside his world, the SS was not a state within a state. It was a criminal machine. His secret maneuvering did not remain secret long. In Hitler's collapsing bunker world, paranoia had become a governing principle. Whispered reports reached him that Himmler was probing for negotiations. At first, Hitler did not want to believe it. Himmler was the loyal one, the man of ritual obedience, the steward of the SS dream. But as the evidence accumulated, the illusion cracked. For Hitler, betrayal was not a personal insult, it was an existential crime, and he responded with the brutal clarity he still possessed. Himmler was dismissed from his posts. The title Reichsführer SS remained on paper for a moment, but the spiritual and political bond that had carried him to power was severed. Hitler denounced him as a traitor. In the final days of April, his name was spoken with contempt in the bunker, and his authority inside the regime evaporated almost overnight. The man who had built terror on loyalty had underestimated what happens when loyalty collapses at the top. Once Hitler cast him out, nobody in the inner core needed to fear Himmler anymore. The aura of inevitability that had protected him for years began to dissolve. Himmler's response was not dramatic. He did not rage. He did not panic publicly. He was not that kind of man. Instead, he retreated into calculation. This is one of the strangest aspects of him. His calm did not depend on success, it depended on habit. Even when the world burned, his mind moved in measured steps. He still read reports, he still wrote directives where he could, he still imagined himself useful, but his usefulness was slipping through his hands. The SS itself was now splitting into survival instincts. Some officers remained fanatically loyal to Hitler. Others quietly prepared to vanish into civilian life. Some tried to destroy evidence. Some tried to preserve it for leverage. The camp system was evacuating westward under chaos. leaving trails of corpses through villages that had never before seen the SS so nakedly desperate. Himmler no longer had full control of this movement, but the system he had created continued to enact its logic even without him. That is the bitter irony of early 1945. Himmler was losing power personally, but his machinery kept killing. For him, the loss of Hitler's trust was more than political exile. It was a spiritual failure. He had spent his life binding loyalty through ritual, building an order that worshipped obedience as sacred. Yet at the final moment he had tried to step outside that oath. Whether he saw it as betrayal or salvation is unclear, but what mattered was the result. The SS myth depended on absolute loyalty to the Führer. Himmler had violated that myth, and no amount of bureaucratic finesse could undo it. Even so, he continued to act as though he still had a role. He attempted to maintain connections with SS offices. He moved between headquarters and field commands, looking for a place in the collapsing structure where his authority might still mean something. But the Reich was now a dying organism. Every limb was acting on instinct rather than central instruction. Himmler was no longer the brain. He was another drifting part. Meanwhile, the Soviets were approaching Berlin. The city was turning into a fortress of rubble. Hitler's world had narrowed to his bunker, and everyone outside it could sense that the end was near. Himmler must have understood this too. But for a man shaped by his own myths, acceptance was harder than hope. He still believed in bargaining, still believed in destiny's twist, still believed he could be something in the next order if the current one collapsed. He clung to the same internal certainty that had guided him through inflation, coups, and war. It had served him before. He expected it to serve him again. But early 1945 did not belong to internal certainty. It belonged to external force. The Allies were not negotiating. The Soviets were not slowing. The German people were not rallying. The SS could not stop history anymore, and neither could its architect. Himmler's last gamble, the attempt to pivot from loyal servant to independent negotiator, had failed. And worse than failing, it had exposed him. In the weeks after his dismissal, his world became smaller and more uncertain. He was still guarded by some loyal aides. He still traveled with documents and a faint sense of command. But he was now a man without a master. And in the Nazi universe, that meant a man without legitimacy. His name, once spoken with quiet fear inside ministries and camps, was now whispered with suspicion even among his own. There is a haunting symmetry here. Himmler had spent his life believing order could outlive chaos, that loyalty could bind men beyond reason, that ritual could grant immunity from fate. In early 1945, he discovered the opposite. Chaos can swallow order, loyalty can evaporate, ritual can become empty theater, and fate does not care how carefully you have arranged your files. Still, he did not collapse into hysteria. He arranged his final steps, as he had arranged everything. Quietly, methodically, with a mind still seeking a path through structure. If the Reich was ending, he would try to survive beyond it. If Hitler had rejected him, he would try to find another authority to accept him. If power could no longer be commanded, perhaps it could be bartered. That was his instinct. But the truth was already written. Himmler had built the very system that made a future for him impossible. He could not reinvent himself before the Allies, because the Allies saw the camps. He could not redeem himself before Germany, because Germany was drowning in the consequences of his policies. He could not return to Hitler, because Hitler would rather see the world burn than forgive betrayal. The chessboard had closed around him. When April approached and Berlin shuddered under artillery, Himmler was no longer at the center of the Reich's Black Order. He was on its margins, still moving, still calculating, still clutching at the threads of a collapsing web. The master of the SS had become a man searching for a door out of his own fortress, only to find that every door led back to the ruins he had helped create. And so, as the Reich staggered into its final weeks, Himmler stepped into the last phase of his story, not as commander or architect, but as fugitive in waiting. The world he had tried to shape through silence and order was now shaping his end, and in that reversal, the calm, disciplined man who had once ruled through ritual was about to confront a reality no ritual could control: the fugitive in uniform. April-May 1945. Berlin was no longer a capital in any real sense when April 1945 arrived. It was a ruin surrounded by fire, a city reduced to corridors of rubble and smoke. The Reich was not collapsing in a single dramatic moment. It was dissolving in thousands of small surrenders, abandoned positions, broken chains of command, and terrified civilians moving westward with whatever they could carry. The world Himmler had spent 2 decades building, layer by layer, memo by memo, oath by oath, was now coming apart like wet paper in a storm. For most of his life, Himmler had operated through distance. He ruled by files, by networks, by carefully designed hierarchies that reached outward without needing his personal presence. Now, distance became his enemy. The web he had spun no longer held. The SS was splintering into fragments, some still killing in blind loyalty, others simply trying to survive, others vanishing into civilian clothing. The camps were emptying in chaotic evacuations. The Gestapo offices were burning their records. The state was in flight. And Himmler, once the architect of inevitability, faced something he had always inflicted on others but rarely experienced himself: uncertainty without structure. In those last days of April, Hitler was sealed in his bunker, preparing a theatrical end. Himmler was out in the collapsing countryside, his authority stripped, his name cursed by the man he had served. Yet he was not a broken figure wandering without purpose. He was still Himmler, methodical, calculating, stoically disciplined. He did not surrender to panic because panic was not a tool he had ever used. He had always trusted procedure, even in the face of chaos. Now he tried to apply the same habit to his own survival. He understood that his name was now poison. The Allies were hunting SS leadership. The Soviets, who had seen the camps and the massacres, would never spare him. Even German civilians, exhausted and half-starved by years of war, might turn on a notorious SS leader if they recognized him. He had to become someone else. Not a different man in spirit, but a different man in appearance. So he did what other fugitives did in that spring. He hid in plain sight. Himmler obtained a set of papers under a false identity and dressed in the uniform of an ordinary soldier. The uniform was not the black SS of his dreams, not the tailored symbol of an elite order. It was plain field gray, the clothing of a defeated army. To Himmler, this must have felt like a kind of humiliation, but also a practical necessity. He was no longer ruling symbolism, he was using it as camouflage. There is something chilling about imagining Himmler in those days. Not because he was suddenly moral or reflective, there is no evidence of that, but because he was so ordinary in his evasion. The man who built an empire of terror moved through the same frightened railway stations and shattered villages as thousands of other Germans. He carried a small bag, a few documents, and a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth. He walked, waited, listened, and observed. Surrounded by ruins he had helped create, he became another ghost in the slow river of refugees and soldiers. Yet he was not quite like the others. Even disguised, he could not stop being himself internally. He still looked for patterns in the chaos. He still evaluated situations as if there were a logic he could identify. He still believed in negotiation and some unseen thread of destiny that might allow him to survive and perhaps reappear. His mind could not accept a simple defeat because defeat would mean that the entire structure of meaning he had built, race, order, loyalty, ritual, had been false. That was too much for a man who had lived inside his own mythology. So he clung to another mythology, that he could still bargain his way into a future. He moved north, away from Berlin and away from the approaching Soviet tide. The direction was not random. Himmler had always respected geography as a system. He knew which zones the Western Allies were occupying, and he calculated that capture by the British or Americans would be far preferable to falling into Soviet hands. The West, he hoped, might view him through the old lens he was trying to offer them: an anti-Bolshevik administrator, an enemy of communism who might still be useful. The idea was fantasy, but in those days, fantasy and survival were often intertwined. The landscape he moved through was hushed in an eerie way, not peaceful, but stunned. Roads were packed with displaced people, women in shawls, children asleep on carts, soldiers limping with bandaged arms, families silent with shock. Entire towns had been bombed into skeletons. Villages were crowded with strangers. Smoke from burning depots or factories still drifted across fields. Himmler walked through this world with a careful stillness, observing everything with the habit of a bureaucrat who had spent his life studying behavior. He traveled with a small group of loyal aides at first. Even after his dismissal, a handful of men still clung to him out of devotion or fear, or because they believed that the SS might yet endure after Hitler. These aides helped him find food and shelter, reminded him of the false identity he must maintain, and guided him toward the north where he hoped to reach zones controlled by the British. They were quiet, disciplined men, products of the system he had shaped, yet even they were uncertain now. Their loyalty was genuine, but their faith in outcome was eroding. At times they rested in farmhouses or small inns. At times they slept in makeshift shelters. The nights were cold. Air raids still happened, though the war was almost over. There were moments when Allied patrols passed near them. There were moments when other German soldiers looked at them without curiosity, too exhausted to ask questions. In those narrow spaces, Himmler was forced to live without the things that defined him: office routines, stacks of reports, the sense of hierarchy around him. Survival required improvisation. The man who had built order through structure was now living by instinct, but he tried to keep his old rhythm alive in private. Even as a fugitive, he rose early. He maintained appearance and posture. He spoke in the measured tones of authority, even when there was no longer authority to command. Habit can become a kind of prison, and Himmler's habits were deep. They kept him calm. They also kept him from fully accepting his condition. A fugitive has to think like prey. Himmler still thought like a planner. Meanwhile, the Reich was dying on schedule. Hitler married Eva Braun and then poisoned himself on April 30th. Berlin fell days later. German forces began surrendering in waves. On May 7th-8th, Germany signed unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was finished. For most Germans, that was a moment of raw relief mixed with dread. For Himmler, it was personal catastrophe. He could no longer claim to represent a state. He could not negotiate on behalf of anything. He was now simply a man wanted for the crimes of a vanished regime. His aides understood that too. Their small group grew thinner as men slipped away, choosing anonymity over loyalty. Some feared being identified with him. Some simply wanted to find their families. Some sensed the futility of staying close to a man who had no future to offer. Himmler did not argue loudly. He did not beg. He watched them go with a controlled, almost icy calm. Loyalty, the sacred force he had worshipped, was leaving him. The irony should have been obvious to him. But again, there is no sign of remorse, only calculation. He attempted to keep moving. The less attention he drew, the better. There were checkpoints everywhere now, Allied, German, improvised. Himmler was traveling through a country that had become a giant net. He carried forged papers identifying him as a low-level soldier named Heinrich Himmler, or similar. The exact alias varied. He wore an eye patch to alter his appearance. He shaved off his SS mustache. These details might sound almost theatrical, but they were the standard toolkit of fugitives at war's end. Himmler was not uniquely clever here. He was simply doing what he had trained thousands of his own officers to hunt in others: concealment, manipulation, survival. He aimed toward the Schleswig-Holstein and the North German coast. The British were controlling larger zones there. If he could reach the right place, he imagined, perhaps he could quietly surrender on his own terms. Perhaps he could present himself not as a hunted criminal, but as a political figure offering cooperation. Even now, the old reflex of authority lingered. He was not just trying to hide, he was trying to position himself. But the world had adjusted more quickly than he had. The Allies knew who Himmler was. His face, his title, his role in the SS and camps had been public knowledge even before the war ended. It was impossible that he would slip through indefinitely. His disguise might fool a tired farmer or a passing soldier. It would not fool trained Allied screeners for long. He was moving inside a shrinking circle. On May 21, 1945, that circle closed. Himmler and his remaining companions were stopped by British troops near Bremerwörde or Lüneburg Heath. Sources vary on the exact checkpoint location, but the sequence is consistent. The British were collecting and screening German soldiers and refugees in the area. Himmler presented his false papers calmly, keeping his voice low and ordinary. At first, there was no dramatic recognition. To the troops, he looked like yet another officer trying to vanish into the tide. But something about him, his bearing, his nervous composure, the precision of his answers, raised suspicion. He did not look like a common enlisted man. He looked like a man used to command. The British detained the group for further screening. These were procedural arrests, not theatrical captures. That matters. Himmler did not fall into a trap of heroism or betrayal. He was caught by paperwork, from the very kind of methodical process he had always trusted. The Allies were sorting humans into categories: soldier, civilian, officer, SS, criminal, using forms, interviews, and cross-checks. Himmler had built his empire on categorization. Now, categorization was tightening around his throat. During questioning, his story began to wobble. The British interrogators noticed inconsistencies. His hands, despite his calm, carried the faint tremor of fear. His accent, his vocabulary, and his manner were not consistent with the identity he claimed. He might have succeeded if the war were still on and the screening chaotic. But the war was over. The Allies had time. They had lists. They had specialists trained to recognize SS men. Himmler was not just any prisoner. His name was among the biggest that still hadn't been publicly accounted for. They searched him more thoroughly. When they removed his eye patch and examined him, the suspicion hardened into recognition. The British officers realized they were holding Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler. The capture was still quiet. No crowd cheered. There was no cinematic confrontation. There was only a tightening stillness in the room, the sober awareness that a major architect of Nazi terror was now in their custody. Himmler responded with a kind of fatalistic calm. He did not fight. He did not beg. He offered his true name when pressed, almost as if confession were another procedure. But beneath that calm lay calculation. He knew what capture meant. He had long expected that if he ever fell into enemy hands, he would face trial and execution. He had prepared for that possibility in the way he prepared for everything, with a contingency plan. The cyanide capsule in his mouth was not a sudden impulse. It was the final ritual of self-control. The British moved him to a holding facility. They photographed him. They searched him again. They began preparing for a more formal interrogation. He was no longer disguised now. His identity was a matter of record. The fugitive in uniform had become a prisoner of history. Yet he still moved with the careful gait of discipline. His posture was upright. His tone remained measured. He behaved, even in defeat, like a man who believed structure could preserve dignity. He was brought to Lüneburg for interrogation by British intelligence. Doctors examined him, partly for health and partly to ensure he carried no hidden poison. The British were aware of the SS practice of suicide with cyanide. They searched his clothing, his bag, his pockets. They did not realize the capsule was already concealed inside his mouth, embedded behind a tooth or within a hidden cavity. Himmler had been careful. On the evening of May 23, 1945, the British conducted another medical inspection before further questioning. It was in this moment that Himmler decided the last step of his life. When the doctor asked him to open his mouth, perhaps he sensed exposure. Perhaps he sensed the loss of control tightening completely. Perhaps he simply followed the plan he had carried for weeks. He crushed the cyanide capsule between his teeth. The reaction was immediate and violent. He convulsed and collapsed. British officers attempted to intervene, but cyanide is fast. Within minutes, Heinrich Himmler was dead. The man who had orchestrated terror through procedure ended his life in a final act of private procedure. There were no speeches, no trial, no dramatic last words, only a brief spasm, a still body, and a quiet room of stunned captors. His death was almost an extension of his personality. Even the ending was controlled, planned, inward, but it was also the ultimate symbol of his failure. He had built a world of absolute obedience, and in the end, he could not face obedience to anyone else's judgment. He had demanded that others go to their deaths for his ideology. He refused to be judged for it. Suicide was his last claim to mastery. The British buried him in an unmarked grave, somewhere on the Lüneburg Heath. They did not want a monument. They did not want a pilgrimage site. They wanted him erased into the soil, anonymous in death as he had tried to be in his final weeks. The news spread quickly through occupied Germany and beyond. Some Nazis were relieved that he had avoided trial. Some were furious that he had betrayed Hitler and then escaped justice. Survivors of the SS system felt the bitter sting of a man dying before answering publicly for what he had done. History, however, did not need his trial to judge him. The documents, camps, graves, and testimonies were already enough. So ended the fugitive's path. It had begun in myth and order, climbed into terrifying power, and closed in a quiet roadside capture that mirrored the methods he himself had used to categorize and destroy lives. In April and May 1945, Himmler had moved through the ruins as a shadow, hoping for a future he had made impossible. His last gamble had failed. His disguise had failed. His dreams of bargaining had failed. All that remained was the cyanide capsule, a final cold token of control. And with his death, the central architect of the SS was gone. But the machinery he had built, its files, its rituals, its crimes, remained for the world to uncover. The man vanished into silence, yet the system he shaped would continue to speak loudly through history's evidence. The next chapter belongs not to Himmler alive, but to Himmler as a legacy, examined in courts, in archives, and in memory that refuses to let quiet death become quiet absolution. After the architect fell, the war did not end with a single silence. It ended in layers. Guns quieted in one place while they still sounded in another. Cities exhaled, but only after holding their breath for years. For survivors and victors alike, the first days after May 1945 were not a clean dawn. They were a gray morning filled with rubble, hunger, displacement, and the heavy question of what had been done, and by whom. Himmler's death closed one life, but it did not close the story. In many ways, it opened it. When the British announced that Heinrich Himmler was dead, the reaction across Germany and Europe was complicated and often contradictory. Among the defeated Nazi leadership, some felt a bitter relief. Himmler was a central organizer of terror, but he was also a man of endless paperwork and sharp internal politics. His absence removed a rival, a man who might have been forced to testify or might have tried to shift blame. Others were quietly furious. They saw suicide as cowardice. They believed a true SS leader should have died in combat or beside Hitler, not in a British holding room by his own hand. There were also those who felt both emotions at once: relief that he had avoided interrogation, outrage that he had escaped judgment. Even in defeat, the Nazi world remained fractured by loyalty, ambition, and myth. But outside that collapsed circle, the mood was different. In occupied Europe, in the camps, in the ruins of towns that had lived under SS occupation, Himmler's death did not feel like closure. It felt like something valuable had been stolen, the chance to see the man who had built so much of this system forced to answer for it. For the victims, the unmarked grave on Lüneburg Heath was not poetic justice. It was a missing face in the courtroom that never happened. Survivors carried the knowledge that the architect of their suffering had ended his own story on his own terms. Yet history does not need a living defendant to reveal a crime. Himmler had built his empire through records, and those records were now falling into Allied hands in enormous quantities. The Allied armies, as they advanced through Germany and liberated the camps, discovered not only corpses and starving prisoners, but warehouses of files, transport schedules, SS reports, camp registries, correspondence between offices, memoranda stamped and signed. The Nazi system had been obsessed with documentation, and Himmler had been its master librarian. He had believed that paperwork was power, that lists could define reality. In the end, those lists became evidence. In the early summer of 1945, Allied investigators began a type of work that had no precedent in scale. They were not just occupying a defeated country, they were trying to understand a machine of destruction that had functioned through normal offices, normal uniforms, and normal bureaucratic routines. What they found again and again was Himmler's fingerprint. Not always literal, but structural. The SS hierarchy, the police networks, the Gestapo reporting chains, the camp administration system, the racial classification offices, the resettlement and deportation schedules. All of them had been shaped by his order-loving mind. Even when specific atrocities had been carried out by others, the architecture belonged to him. At first, this was not obvious to every outsider. Himmler was not a public celebrity in the way Hitler or Goebbels had been. Older Germans may have known him as the stiff, bespectacled Reichsführer, but many civilians could not have described him clearly. The SS itself had operated like a state within a state. It was everywhere, yet invisible in its decision-making. Now, as investigators pulled files from ruined ministries and camp offices, the invisible became visible. The central role of the SS, and Himmler's place at its center, was confirmed beyond doubt. The world's first real reckoning with this system began at Nuremberg. The International Military Tribunal opened in November 1945, only months after Himmler's death. Its purpose was historic and moral. to place leading Nazi officials on trial for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Himmler, had he lived, would almost certainly have faced the tribunal alongside Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, and others. Yet, even in his absence, his work dominated the courtroom. When prosecutors spoke of the SS as a criminal organization, they were describing the creature that Himmler had raised from a minor bodyguard unit into the steel spine of terror. At Nuremberg, the SS was declared a criminal organization. So was the Gestapo. This mattered severely. It meant that membership in these bodies was not morally neutral, not merely service to the state. It was participation in a criminal system. For the first time, Himmler's lifelong obsession with building an elite order was publicly inverted. The very exclusivity he had cultivated became proof of collective guilt. As the trials continued, witnesses described camps whose operations were shaped by bureaucratic routine. Survivors spoke of roll calls, labor assignments, medical inspections, transport lists, and the relentless precision of camp order turned lethal. The prosecutors did not need to dramatize Himmler's personality. They needed only to read SS directives, camp regulations, and organizational charts. The language of documents was calm. That was part of its horror. It matched the calm machinery he had believed in. Paperwork that had once moved deaths across Europe now moved into the courtroom as evidence. In occupied Germany itself, another reckoning was beginning. Slower, messier, and less heroic than Nuremberg. It was called denazification. The Allies attempted to remove Nazi influence from public life, to screen millions of Germans for their level of involvement, and to rebuild society on new foundations. This was a monumental task. The Nazis had governed for 12 years and had made party membership, SS service, and ideological conformity part of ordinary careers. Himmler's system had been deeply interwoven into police forces, schools, farms, and industries. Untangling that web without destroying the whole fabric of society was almost impossible. Many SS officers tried to disappear into civilian anonymity just as Himmler had tried. Some burned their uniforms and papers. Some assumed false names. Some fled to rural areas. Others were captured quickly. Camp guards, Gestapo agents, and SS administrators were rounded up across Europe. Some faced trial in local courts. Some were sent to work camps. Some were executed, but many also slipped through early screens. The chaos of the post-war moment allowed gaps, and existing institutions sometimes protected the very people they should have exposed. The Allied occupation forces were overwhelmed. Justice was uneven. For survivors, this was another painful irony. The system that Himmler had designed to be efficient in terror was met by a post-war system that was messy in judgment. By the late 1940s, more formal trials began to fill in what Nuremberg could not cover. The Dachau trials prosecuted camp personnel and SS officers. Poland and Czechoslovakia held trials of their own. The Soviet Union conducted brutal proceedings in its occupied zones. Israel, years later, would capture and try Adolf Eichmann, the logistics mastermind of deportations, a man who had worked within the SS structure Himmler oversaw. Each courtroom, each testimony, each archive entry tightened the historical net around the absent architect. Yet alongside justice, something else was happening. Memory was taking shape. Not official memory, but human memory. Survivors began to rebuild lives, often in shattered towns or in distant countries. They carried stories that had not yet been named by museums or textbooks. Many were too traumatized to speak. Many feared disbelief, but some began to write, record, and testify. Over time, these testimonies formed a parallel archive to the Nazi paperwork. Himmler had once believed the SS could define reality through documents. Now, the victims were defining reality through witness. In Germany, the first post-war years were filled with silence. This silence was not always denial. Sometimes it was shock, exhaustion, or shame. Many Germans felt they had been dragged into disaster by leaders who claimed they were protecting the nation. Others did not want to confront what they had seen or participated in. Many had lost family members, homes, or futures, and immediate survival outweighed moral reconstruction. And in the early Cold War, political priorities shifted quickly. The Western Allies began to view the Soviet Union as the new enemy, and that created pressure to stabilize West Germany fast. In that stabilization, some former Nazis were quietly reintegrated. The process of full moral reckoning was delayed. Still, the evidence did not disappear. Archives grew. Scholars, journalists, and investigators returned to the records again and again. They traced the lines of command, the paper trails of deportation, the fiscal networks of the SS enterprises, and the ideology embedded in every regulation. The more they dug, the clearer Himmler's centrality became. He had not just followed Hitler's vision, he had engineered its tools. He was not only a fanatic, but also a manager of fanaticism. His gift for organization had amplified evil into industrial magnitude. With time, public understanding of Himmler also evolved. In the immediate post-war years, he was seen mainly as a symbol of SS terror, the cold bureaucrat who ran camps and police. Later, scholarship widened the lens. Historians examined his personality and discovered something both banal and terrifying. A man who was not a storming battlefield leader, not even a particularly brilliant thinker, but a tireless planner who made horror feel routine. They saw a man fascinated by myth and ritual, who used symbols to romanticize brutality and make obedience feel sacred. He was not a flamboyant monster. He was a quiet one, precisely why he could function so effectively. The castles, runes, and ceremonies that once looked eccentric in isolation began to make sense in the larger picture. Wewelsburg was not a harmless fantasy retreat. It was a cultural factory for SS identity. His obsession with ancestry and purity was not a private hobby. It was a policy engine that shaped who lived, who died, and who was enslaved. The black uniforms were not mere theater. They were psychological weapons. Himmler's world shows how a man can merge myth with administration so seamlessly that cruelty becomes a kind of duty. For an older audience today, especially in America, there's a sobering lesson here. We tend to imagine evil as loud, a screaming dictator, a chaotic mob, a spectacular villain. Himmler teaches a different and more unsettling truth. Evil can be quiet. It can come in the form of neat files, clean uniforms, well-run offices, and a calm man who believes order is higher than compassion. The mechanisms of civilization, bureaucracy, discipline, loyalty, are not automatically good. In the wrong hands, they become power without conscience. The Holocaust and the SS Empire were not accidents of wartime panic. They were built. They were designed. They were staffed by people who often considered themselves respectable, dutiful, and even idealistic. That is the deepest legacy of Himmler. The demonstration that method can multiply fanaticism. A single ideologue, if he arranges the right structures, can turn thousands of ordinary routines into extraordinary destruction. In the decades after the war, memorials rose on the ruins of camps. Museums collected artifacts. Archives opened. Holocaust education became a cornerstone of historical awareness in the West. Yet, with each new document and each new testimony, Himmler's presence remained, like a shadow behind the ledger. His body was gone, but the system he'd made could not be buried. It had left too many scars, too many records, too many graves. Even now, when visitors walk through Auschwitz or Treblinka or Dachau, they encounter the chilling order of those places, the railway lines, the barrack rows, the registration numbers, the sheer administrative precision of cruelty. That order was not a natural feature of war. It was a choice, Himmler's choice. Every camp had commanders and guards who carried out the daily tasks, but above them all was the ideology and structure he insisted on. The camps were not the byproduct of chaos. They were the byproduct of planned, ritualized control. And so, after the architect fell, the building remained for the world to examine. The SS was dismantled, its symbols banned, its leaders hunted, its mythology discredited. But the question Himmler leaves behind is not only what happened, it is, how was it made to happen so efficiently? That question drives historians even today because it speaks beyond one era. It speaks to any society where order is valued more than humanity, where obedience becomes a virtue without moral anchor. Himmler died before a tribunal could pronounce sentence. Yet the sentence has been written in history's ink for 80 years. Each survivor's testimony, each archived directive, each gravesite, each classroom lesson is part of it. His name is not remembered because he was charismatic or heroic. It is remembered because he built a structure that proved how far human beings can go when discipline is detached from conscience. In the quiet that followed his death, Europe did not return instantly to normal life. It rebuilt slowly, painfully, with memory and justice walking unevenly beside each other. But it did rebuild. The SS did not rise again. The Reich did not last 1,000 years. Himmler's dreams were ashes by the summer of 1945, and yet his legacy remains an open warning. Not a dramatic warning shouted from a podium, but a steady one written in files in ruins and in the stories of those who lived through his order. The architect fell, but the world still studies the blueprint, so it never has to be drawn again. The Quiet Man and the Machinery. If you stood on a street in Munich in the early 1920s and watched people pour out of beer halls, you probably wouldn't have noticed him. He wasn't the one shouting on a crate, pumping a fist, or waving to the crowd. He wouldn't have been surrounded by admirers. He would have been a thin young man with careful posture, a notebook in his pocket, and a habit of listening more than speaking. His voice was not built for thunder. His talent was not spectacle. Yet, within 2 decades, this quiet figure would become one of the most powerful men in Europe, and the organizer behind some of the worst crimes in modern history. The puzzle of Heinrich Himmler is not that he was loud enough to seize attention. The puzzle is that he didn't need to be. Himmler's power grew the way ivy grows on stone, slowly, patiently, and with a kind of inevitability that only becomes obvious once the wall is already covered. He did not storm into the Nazi movement as a natural leader. He arrived as a believer looking for a system. Germany, after the First World War, was a place where hunger and humiliation lived side by side. Inflation ate salaries and savings. Veterans returned to a country that seemed to have forgotten them. Every street contained both despair and argument. In that atmosphere, politics did not feel like a debate. It felt like survival. Extremes flourished because ordinary life felt unstable. Himmler, already shaped by a desire for order and certainty, found in National Socialism a movement that promised to take chaos and turn it into a pattern. At first, he was ordinary. He joined the party in 1923, served small roles as a clerk, a secretary, and a helper at rallies. He was not a war hero. His brief service near the end of the First World War was too late to become a legend. He was not the kind of man who naturally commanded rooms, but what he lacked in charisma he replaced with attention. He watched who mattered, how power moved, and which systems held people together. He liked uniforms not because they were stylish, but because they erased ambiguity. He liked rules because they made the world predictable. He liked rituals because they turned belief into muscle memory. The SS was tiny when he met it. It was a small bodyguard unit formed to protect Hitler at meetings and marches. It had no special prestige. Most party members considered the SA, the brawling stormtroopers, far more important. The SA filled streets with noise and fists. The SS stood in the background. Yet the background is exactly where Himmler felt comfortable. He saw the SS the way a gardener sees a seedling. Not impressive now, but full of future if shaped correctly. In 1929, Hitler appointed Himmler leader of this minor unit. It was a quiet promotion, almost an administrative footnote in the party's larger story. Few people noticed. Himmler noticed. He treated the position like a calling. His first instinct was not to make the SS big. His instinct was to make it pure. He believed that an elite organization did not need numbers. It needed identity. He set strict entry standards, demanding political loyalty, physical fitness, and racial ancestry. He required applicants to prove Aryan bloodlines through family records. It was a grotesque idea, but to Himmler it felt like logic dressed in destiny. He was creating a brotherhood that would see itself as chosen, separated from ordinary Germans by both discipline and myth. The SS oath to Hitler became more than a promise. It was presented as a sacred bond. He also understood the psychology of belonging. If you want men to feel different, you give them a different uniform, different symbols, and a different story. Under Himmler, the SS adopted its black uniform and silver insignia. They were designed to look severe, modern, and strange, part police, part knightly order. The design was not accidental. It created a visual world where SS men could see themselves as something almost supernatural. Himmler encouraged ceremonies with torches and solemn oaths. He promoted symbolism rooted in invented Germanic tradition. He wasn't simply organizing guards, he was creating a faith. This focus on ritual might sound like theater, but it had a cold purpose. Ritual binds behavior. It makes obedience emotional. Himmler didn't want SS men to follow orders out of fear of punishment alone. He wanted them to follow because they believed their obedience was meaningful. This is a crucial point for understanding how his machinery later functioned. When belief and discipline are fused, cruelty becomes routine. It doesn't need constant rage, it can be carried out calmly. As the Nazi Party rose to power in 1933, Himmler's SS was ready to expand. Hitler needed an organization that could enforce loyalty and eliminate enemies, both real and imagined. The SA were too unruly, too strident, too tied to street violence. Himmler's SS was different. It was orderly, it kept records, it understood hierarchy. Himmler was patient enough to wait while others fought for attention. That patience paid off. He moved quietly into the police world, becoming head of police in Bavaria, and soon controlling political policing across Germany. Through alliances with figures like Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler absorbed the Gestapo into SS control. He didn't just create an organization, he built a network. This network was one of the most modern instruments of control the world had seen. He merged the SS, police, and intelligence functions into a single machine that could track, arrest, and destroy opposition with chilling efficiency. The Gestapo did not need to be everywhere physically. It needed to be feared as if it were everywhere. Himmler understood that fear spreads best when it is quiet. A knock on the door at night is more terrifying than a riot in the street. A rumor of surveillance reshapes behavior more deeply than a visible soldier. The system ran on paperwork, informants, and predictable routines. It was the tyranny of forms and files. Himmler's inner world also mattered. He wasn't simply a technocrat, he was intoxicated by myth. He believed Germany's future required not only political unity but spiritual rebirth rooted in imagined Aryan ancestry. He filled his mind with medieval fantasies, Germanic legends, and occult ideas, and he fed these into SS culture. He created the Ahnenerbe, an SS research institute meant to prove ancient Aryan superiority through archaeology and pseudoscience. He turned Wewelsburg Castle into a symbolic SS sanctuary, a place of ceremonies and myth-making. These were not harmless eccentricities. They were tools that wrapped racial ideology in a sacred cloak, making the SS feel like guardians of destiny instead of criminals. By the late 1930s, Himmler's SS had become a state within a state. It controlled police forces, intelligence, terror squads, and a growing economic empire. It ran its own businesses, farms, and settlements. It built training schools and racial offices. It recruited families into SS life so that ideology could persist through generations. This is where the quiet man's real genius, if we can use that word for something so monstrous, revealed itself. He understood that power is not only an act, it is an infrastructure. If your organization controls the police, the courts, the prisons, the economic activity, and the narrative of belonging, you do not need to argue for power, you live inside it. When the war began in 1939, Himmler saw it as the great testing ground of his system. The SS expanded into occupied territories alongside the army. They ran security operations, resettlement programs, and mass shootings. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units under SS command, followed the army into Poland and the Soviet Union, murdering Jews, Roma, political officials, and others on an industrial scale before the camps even reached their peak. Himmler's role was not the pulling of a trigger. It was the shaping of the environment where triggers were pulled thousands of times a day by men trained to obey and believe. The concentration camps, which had begun as prisons for political opponents, grew into an enormous complex of forced labor and extermination. Under Himmler, the SS built camps across Germany and occupied Europe. Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek, and many others. Each camp did not operate as a chaotic outburst of cruelty, but as a bureaucratic system with schedules, quotas, and reports. Himmler demanded efficiency. Labor was organized like a factory line. Death was recorded like inventory. The system's coldness was its strength, and Himmler had designed it to function without needing emotional frenzy. There is a reason this chapter is called The Quiet Man and the Machinery. We live in a world that often expects evil to look wild. We expect it to be irrational, theatrical, or obviously mad. Himmler was not that. He was a man who drank herbal tea, worried about his health, and wrote long memos about discipline and housekeeping. He could talk about SS farming projects in one breath and camp mortality statistics in the next. His cruelty was embedded in his idea of order. He didn't see himself as a brute. He saw himself as an architect serving a higher mission. That self-image made the machinery possible. By 1943 and 1944, as Germany's fortunes turned, Himmler's illusions grew more obvious. He tried to command on the battlefield despite lacking the instincts of a real general. His interventions often irritated professional officers. He began leaning harder into mystical thinking, astrologers, prophecies, and fantasies of destiny saving the Reich. Yet, even as his personal grasp loosened, the machinery he had built kept moving. That is one of the most haunting truths in this story. A system designed well enough can continue to cause suffering even when its builder becomes delusional or panicked. The SS had become self-propelling. In the final months of the war, the quiet man who had risen by loyalty and order tried to save himself by secret negotiation. He reached out to Western allies, hoping to separate his fate from Hitler's. It was a betrayal of the very oath he had made sacred. Hitler discovered it and cast him out. The machinery he had shaped no longer answered to him completely, yet his fear of facing justice was real. When the British captured him in May 1945, he did what he had taught others never to do. He chose self-preservation over duty. He swallowed cyanide and died within minutes. That death ended the man, but the machinery remained in history. The world discovered the full scale of his system through documents and testimonies. Nuremberg would convict the SS and Gestapo as criminal organizations. Survivors would rebuild lives while carrying memories no file could hold. Germany would wrestle, slowly and painfully, with how much of the machinery had been woven into ordinary society. Himmler, who believed paperwork could define reality, left behind paperwork that defined his guilt. The difficult thing to accept, especially for those of us who grew up believing progress makes civilization safer, is how ordinary the mechanisms were. Lists, uniforms, memos, inspections, rituals, bureaucratic chains. These are normal tools of society. Himmler showed that when those tools are divorced from conscience, they do not restrain evil, they enable it. His story is not just about a man, it is about a method. And methods, once proven, can tempt future people in future ages if societies forget the cost. So when we look back at Himmler, we are not looking at a cartoon villain. We are looking at a quiet believer who worshipped order above humanity and built a machine that could outlive his own sanity. That is why his name endures. Not because he was loud, but because he turned silence into structure, structure into obedience, and obedience into catastrophe. In the next chapter, we'll step closer to the human crossroads inside that machinery, where ordinary people became SS men, camp guards, clerks, and collaborators. We'll look at the slow, subtle transformation that made cruelty feel routine, and how the machinery of Himmler's world could pull thousands into its rhythm without ever asking them to shout. The ordinary faces behind the black uniform. To understand Heinrich Himmler's power, we have to do something uncomfortable. We have to stop looking only at him. We have to look at the people who made his system breathe. Himmler built the SS like a machine, but machines do not run on steel alone. They run on hands, habits, and minds. And the most disturbing truth is that many of those hands belong to men who did not begin as monsters, nor even imagine they were becoming part of one of history's darkest engines. They were ordinary Germans in an extraordinary time, and Himmler understood exactly how to turn their ordinary longings into a weapon. The Germany of the 1920s and early 1930s was a country of bruises. Families who had saved for years watched their money turn to dust during hyperinflation. Men who had marched into the Great War with pride returned to a republic that felt confused and weak. Politics became a battlefield of bitterness, and people grew hungry not only for food, but for certainty. In that hunger, belonging became precious. A uniform meant you were not alone. A chant meant your voice mattered. A ritual meant the world was still governed by rules. Himmler's genius was not inventing those needs, it was organizing them. When he took command of the SS, he made recruitment feel like selection into a brotherhood. In a society struggling with chaos, the SS offered structure. Its training emphasized posture, cleanliness, precision, and repetition. You did not merely learn to march, you learned to move as part of a story. Himmler insisted that SS men understand themselves as heirs to an ancient mission, guardians of Germany's imagined racial future. It was a fantasy, built on lies and cruelty, but it was wrapped in ceremony that made it feel noble. The careful screening for ancestry was not only a racist filter, it was a psychological initiation. It told recruits, "You are different, you are chosen." And once you accept being chosen, you accept the duty that comes with it, no matter how ugly that duty becomes. Himmler also made the SS feel like a world apart from the rest of society. The black uniform was a boundary. It separated a man from neighbors, co-workers, old friends. It offered status and identity in exchange for obedience. The SS man did not need to think of himself as brutal. He only needed to think of himself as loyal. And loyalty, once made sacred, can be twisted into anything. That is why Himmler put such weight on rituals. Torchlit oaths, solemn gatherings, symbols carved into rings or flags. Each ritual was a thread pulling recruits deeper into a moral universe where their actions were judged not by human empathy, but by ideological duty. Men came for different reasons. Some were fanatics from the beginning, thrilled by Nazi race hatred and eager for violence. Others were careerists. The SS expanded rapidly after 1933, and with expansion came jobs, promotions, housing, and privilege. Himmler built SS settlements and businesses, giving his men and their families steady income and protected status. For a young man with a wife and children, the SS could look like stability. For a man without prospects, it could look like opportunity. For a man craving belonging, it could look like a home. Himmler turned loyalty into a pathway upward, and in doing so, he linked personal ambition to institutional cruelty. There were also men who joined because the SS developed a reputation as an elite within the Nazi state. The SA might have been louder, but the SS was cleaner, more disciplined, more selective. It carried prestige that mattered to men raised in a culture that respected hierarchy and authority, and Himmler fed this carefully. He did not want SS men to see themselves merely as soldiers. He wanted them to see themselves as an order with a higher calling. He encouraged reading circles, ideological lectures, and training that mixed military topics with Nazi racial doctrine and myth. The SS man was taught to believe that his obedience had a cosmic meaning. That belief was a shield against doubt. Once men were inside, Himmler's system shaped their daily lives. An SS career was not only a job, it was a lifestyle. Himmler pushed his men to marry suitable women and produce children who would carry forward the racial mission. Through programs like Lebensborn, he tried to create a future SS society from the cradle. Children of SS families grew up observing that their fathers wore black uniforms and were treated with respect, fear, or privilege. Home life was framed by ideology as much as affection. In that environment, cruelty could be normalized not by shouting, but by routine. Himmler understood that a system lasts longer when it plants itself in families, not just barracks. The quietest and perhaps most terrifying transformation happened not in grand speeches but in the paperwork of SS life. Himmler loved administration because it makes violence feel like a task. A form does not scream. A list does not plead. A schedule does not cry. As the SS took control of police forces and intelligence, its men learned that power could be exercised through procedure. Arrests were processed as files. Surveillance became a weekly report. Deportations became transportation schedules. Each step carried moral weight, but the SS man was trained to see steps, not victims. This is how human beings become cogs. Not by waking up eager for evil, but by learning to work inside a system where evil is divided into manageable routines. By the time the war began, the SS had grown into a vast empire of roles. There were Waffen-SS soldiers at the front. There were Gestapo officers in cities. There were camp guards, clerks, doctors, engineers, builders, accountants. The machinery of terror required all of them. Himmler's oversight extended through a hierarchy that rewarded obedience and punished hesitation. But more importantly, it created a culture where cruelty was validated by group identity. Within SS circles, moral reversal became normal. Compassion was weakness, pity was betrayal, brutality was discipline. The man who once might feel a pang of conscience was surrounded by others who treated conscience as a flaw. In such a world, even decent instincts can rot. Consider the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads that followed the German army into Eastern Europe. Their commanders and men were SS and police officers trained to see populations through the lens of racial ideology. They carried out mass shootings in fields and forests, sometimes killing entire villages in a single day. These men were not acting in a vacuum. They were acting inside the discipline Himmler had shaped. Orders flowed down, reports flowed up. Efficiency was praised, and ideology framed murder as duty. Some perpetrators wrote home describing their work as difficult but necessary. Others became numb quickly. Some enjoyed it. The variety of human responses mattered less than the system itself, because the system made the outcome inevitable. The camps deepened this same transformation. When SS, men were assigned to concentration and extermination camps, they entered a world that functioned like a grim factory. The daily rhythm, roll calls, labor assignments, punishments, transports, selections, was a schedule of suffering. Again, Himmler's obsession with method ensured that the camps were run as bureaucratic organisms. Guards were evaluated on discipline. Administrators were judged on efficiency. Doctors and clerks performed their roles inside a structure that minimized moral reflection. Even language was engineered to dull reality. People were units, deaths were transfers, killings were special treatment. These euphemisms were not accident. They were the linguistic oil that kept the machinery running smoothly. It's important to say clearly, not everyone who encountered the SS became its servant. Some Germans resisted in small or large ways. Some refused. Some helped victims. But Himmler's system was designed to make resistance rare and costly, and to reward participation generously. The SS man was surrounded by privilege in his work world, status in his community, and ideological reinforcement in his home life. The system did not need to convince him every day. It only needed to keep him moving. There is a subtle trap when we tell stories like this. We risk making it sound as if history simply happened to these men, as if they were swept away without agency. That is not true. Each SS man made choices, even if those choices were shaped by fear, ambition, or conformity. Himmler created the conditions, but people still stepped into them. Understanding that is not about excusing guilt. It is about warning ourselves how easily guilt can be distributed across routines until no one feels responsible. Himmler's world shows that evil often thrives not in chaos, but in order without conscience. By the mid-war years, the SS had become so embedded in Nazi Germany that its men often thought of themselves as the state's backbone. Himmler pushed this idea constantly. He praised his men as the political soldiers who carried the Reich's future in their blood. He visited camps and front units, sometimes speaking about their mission in solemn, almost priestly tones. His manner was calm, administrative, and chilling because it treated atrocity as normal work. That calmness echoed down the chain. Many SS men learned to carry out terrifying actions while maintaining a polite voice, a tidy uniform, and a sense of righteousness. In that contrast between appearance and reality lies one of the deepest horrors of Himmler's design. As Germany began to lose the war, the SS world did not suddenly wake up to guilt. Many simply tried to survive. Some intensified brutality as the system collapsed. forcing death marches and last-minute killings of prisoners to erase evidence or fulfill ideology. Others fled. Some tried to blend into civilian life. Himmler himself tried to slip away disguised as a common soldier. A final irony for a man who had made uniform sacred. But behind him were thousands of SS men who now faced the ruin of their imagined mission. Most of them had not been forced into this path by Himmler personally. They had been shaped by the system he built and the choices they made within it. After the war, the world would learn the scale of what that system had done, and many SS men would claim they were just following orders. That phrase became the last refuge of the obedient. Himmler had designed obedience so thoroughly that it could be used as a defense even when it was the weapon. The Nuremberg trials rejected that excuse as a moral shield, and so should history. Yet those trials also revealed a hard truth. Many perpetrators did not look like demons. They looked like men who had learned to stop thinking in human terms. That is the heart of this chapter. Himmler's power was not magic. It was method, and method requires people to carry it. The SS was filled with a grim spectrum, from sadists to careerists to conformists, but all were drawn into the same machinery because Himmler made belonging more powerful than conscience. He built a world where ordinary needs, security, identity, status, could be harnessed into extraordinary cruelty. When we look at those ordinary faces behind black uniforms, we aren't asked to pity them. We are asked to recognize the warning they represent. A society can train people to do almost anything if the system rewards obedience, honors myth, and silences doubt. That warning is not limited to Germany in the 1930s. It belongs to every age, including our own. The tools of Himmler's machinery, bureaucracy, ritual, hierarchy, identity politics, fear, and the promise of belonging, are not ancient relics. They are human possibilities. Any society that allows order to replace empathy or myth to replace truth risks opening a door to the same quiet drift into cruelty. And so, as we close this story, the quiet man at the center becomes clearer. Heinrich Himmler did not merely command murderers. He cultivated them. He took ordinary longings and wrapped them in ideology. He turned uniforms into faith. He turned paperwork into power. He turned loyalty into a moral compass that pointed only toward destruction. This is why his legacy is studied with such dread. Not because it is distant, but because it shows how close darkness can sit to routine. In our next chapter, we'll step into the final unraveling, how Himmler's machinery, so carefully built, began to collapse under the weight of war, how his own confidence fractured, and how the man who believed history was his to command tried, in the end, to escape the world he had designed.